6 years I tallied grain for the Third Army, counted straight, never once light on the scale. My record stayed clean until someone powerful needed a guilty name. My last count fed the garrison at Sedgeford. 40 men. Every one of them died on a tally that was never mine to falsify, and I have carried the arithmetic of that ever since. Seth Boland rewrote my ledger after I signed it. Seth Boland is also the Captain General's own brother, so the blame walked south instead of north, and south was where I happened to be standing. They cut the edge of my ear for it. Marched me to the last post on the road out of Vetch Hollow. Left me there with an empty belly and a brand no market would ever trust. Dawn came gray over the crossroads. My stomach picked the direction before my feet did. A brand stops a man from trading. It does not stop him from looking. The market row of Vetch Hollow sat where two roads met, stalls shoulder to shoulder under a guild banner. At the head of it stood the weighing stall, brass scale bolted hard to a post. That post belonged to Ostran Vale, District Master, Weighmaster. No scale in the county was legal without his stamp cut fresh into the beam. He owned the difference between a trade and a crime. He took a toll for the stamp. That one he took in the open. Then came a second toll, softer, from anyone who needed a weighing to lean their own way. I had one thing left in the world to sell, my father's counting rod. Brass shod, true ash, notched by his own hand down every span of its length. I held it out to Vale and asked him to weigh it fair. Told him the brass alone was worth a week of bread. Any honest buyer would have said the same. He did not look at the rod first. He turned my ear to the light instead. Studied the cut edge like a man checking a coin for file marks. A branded short weigher, he said, carries the district's presumption before he opens his mouth. Doubly so with a measuring stick in his hand. He seemed pleased with the phrasing. I told him the rod counted grain and never once counted coin. The brand on my ear was for a ledger crime. It had nothing to do with cheating a scale. Said a man who lies with numbers once lies with numbers always. The row around us went quiet enough to hear the scale chains settle on their hooks. He set the rod on his own brass pan and weighed it against nothing at all. Then he named a third of its worth. Toll owed, he said, for the privilege of being examined. I said a third was theft with a stamp on it. He said the stamp was the only thing standing between theft and law in this county. He said it without heat. Two men in the row laughed. At me, of course. A woman pulled her child back a full step, as though whatever I carried might be catching. The row let her. Vale closed his hand around the rod. He dropped it into the toll box bolted beside the scale. The lid shut with a sound like a small door closing on a small room. I said I would have it back, notch for notch, every span of it. He said poor men promised him that every season, and not one of them had managed it yet. I had walked into Vetch Hollow owning one object. I left that stall owning none. The row watched me go, every step of it, and enjoyed the watching. Before I reached the end of it, a bread seller named Perrin Duck had a girl by the wrist. He was pulling her away from his table, loud enough for the row to hear him do it. He owed 4 bits on last month's loaves, he said. An old family account, grown slow over years of flour weights that never sat quite square. 4 bits unpaid was 4 bits he could not feed his own children on. The girl was young and black-haired, dressed for temple work rather than market work. She did not fight him. She stood very straight and let him finish. Her name was Nayla Ost. I would learn that later. Keeper of a shrine, the county had struck off its rolls the season her mother died inside it. She said she would have the 4 bits by the week's end. Doak said the week's end fed no one today. Then he pushed her clear of his table with the flat of his hand. Vale watched all of it from his stall without moving. It was the kind of stillness that meant he approved. He did not need to say so, and he did not. I had nothing to give her. My hands were as empty as her account was. So I did the only thing left to a hungry man with nothing in them. I walked on. Past the last stall, the road forked toward the county gate. A line of carts waited there. A drover was shouting, and the air held a heavy smell of wet leather. The drover was a heavy man named Halderpike. He was arguing with the gate warden. The argument was about a stack of hides soaked through in 3 days of rain. The warden weighed the hides by the bundle and called them overweight for toll. So Pike was paying coin for water. Water he had never once asked the sky to add. I told Pike I could show him whether the weight in his hides was hide or rain. For nothing. He looked at my ear before he looked at my face. He asked what a branded man knew about hides. I said, 6 years of army tallying teaches you to smell a wet lie. You smell it well before you weigh it. I cut a fist-sized scrap from the wettest bundle, wrung it hard over the dust until it stopped dripping. Then I held it next to a dry scrap from a bundle already paid for. Then I built a small fire out of cart straw. I charred both scraps to the same dry crackle, set them on the warden's own scale, side by side, where the row could see. The 2 charred scraps weighed near enough the same, near enough that the pointer barely moved. The warden's face told the Rao what his mouth was refusing to. A third of every wet bundle was water. Water the drover had already paid toll on. I said so aloud, where the full gate line could hear me say it. Pike did his own count on his fingers, swore once with feeling. Then he told the warden he would pay by dry weight from now on, or take his custom to the North Road. The warden reweighed the string of bundles by the charred method. Pike's toll dropped by near a third. It happened before the last cart had rolled through the gate. Pike turned and asked what I wanted for the trick. I said bread. I had not eaten since the last post on the road, and my hands were beginning to say so. He laughed, short and surprised. Then he gave me a full round loaf, still warm from his own saddlebag. Any man who saved him coin, he said, ate first from his table. He asked my name before I could turn away. I told him Doran Kell. He said a name like that ought to be worth remembering by winter, and went back to his carts. It was the first food I had earned by proof since the day they cut my ear. Earned and not given. It sat heavier in my hand than its true weight ever accounted for. I asked around the gate for anywhere a branded man could sleep for free. An old woman pointed south. She did it without once looking at my face. There is a shrine past the mill, she said. Struck off the rolls, with no god left in it worth robbing, and no one troubles a man who sleeps among struck gods. The shrine stood behind a broken wall. The roof had half fallen in. A single altar stone sat swept clean under it, kept that way by somebody's stubborn hand. I sat against the altar and ate half the loaf slowly, because a man who has learned hunger eats like it might come back. Mine had come back twice already. The other half I looked at for a long while. Then I set it on the altar stone. A shrine with a swept floor deserved better than an empty one, and I had nothing else on me. I found an ash branch behind the broken wall, straight enough for a beam. I spent the last light of the evening shaving it true. My belt knife did the work. I knotted a length of scavenged cord at even spans. Each knot went in by feel, as the army had taught me. By the end, I had a rope no market could shorten on me. By the time the beam and the rope lay finished beside me, the dark had come down entirely. I slept sitting up against cold stone with both of them under my arm. Something small landed on my chest sometime before dawn. Then a voice spoke. It had no business coming from a cat-sized shape, and it announced that my bread was short by a full dram. I opened my eyes. A creature the size of a large house cat sat on my ribs, fur the color of old grain, eyes far too aware for the size of the skull holding them. She said her name was Vesa. She had once been called the Even Hand. Also, whoever baked my bread had cheated the flour by a dram a loaf and ought to be ashamed of it. I asked her what she was. She said a god, in the tone another creature might use to say hungry. Then she added that my hovel of a temple measured 4 paces short of her memory. I told her the temple was not mine. Neither was the shortfall. She said that was what every mortal said, about every shortfall ever measured in her long experience. She hopped down onto the altar, sniffed the half loaf I had left there, announced its true weight aloud, then ate a corner of it without asking me first. I asked why anyone would leave a god to starve in a broken shrine. She went quiet. The kind of quiet that meant the question cost her something to answer. She said honesty had become a paid service in this county. Sold by the stamp, priced by the stamp, and a god of honest measure starves fastest of all when that happens. I asked what she could do. A hungry god with opinions was not going to fill a stomach on its own. It was not going to clear anybody's debt either. Once at each dawn, and only once, she could give one person back what had been measured wrong against them. 2 conditions held. They had to stand present, and the crooked measure had to still be showable. I asked what happened if no one remembered her at all. She said the district had not seen what she could do in 200 years. That frightened her more than the hunger did. I asked why she did not announce herself to the county at once and be done with hiding. She said a god who shouts is a god a guild can burn. Burned before the dawn even breaks. Her gift needed a witness who could still point at the crooked measure with their own hand. Otherwise, it had nothing honest left to correct. That was her limit, start to finish. I thought of the girl at the bread table, of an old family debt grown slow over years of flour weighed against her. Then I said her name aloud into the dark. Vesa asked who Nayla Ost was to me. I said a stranger. A stranger I had watched get shoved off a table for a debt that smelled wrong from the first word. She said a debt built on short measure was the kind of wrong she could touch. Then she asked me to swear to bring the girl to the shrine before dawn broke. I did not know where Nayla slept. Only that shrine keepers rarely sleep far from their shrines. I found her within the hour behind the broken wall, kneeling at her mother's marker. I told her a god had a debt to settle on her behalf. She only had to stand at the altar before first light. She looked at me like a woman deciding whether hunger had made me strange. She came anyway. A girl with nothing left to lose has less reason than most to refuse a stranger's strange offer. I have thought about that since. Vesa sat the two of us down and explained the debt herself. Her voice was far too matter-of-fact for the size of what she was describing. Nayla's hands went still in her lap. At the first gray line of dawn, Vesa touched one paw to the altar stone. She said the words like a clerk reading out a closed account. The shrine's broken stones seemed to hold their breath. The debt on the Ost family's grain had been measured 6 years past by a weight since proven false. She struck it from every ledger that had ever carried it. Here and everywhere else it was written. Nayla made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. She pressed both hands flat against the altar, checking, I think, that it was real stone and not dream stone. Vesa then announced, without any prompting, that Nayla's shoes were a half size wrong. Wrong for her actual feet. Someone ought to see to that separately, she said. I laughed before I could stop myself. Nayla laughed too. For one short moment, that shrine held more warmth than its broken roof had any right to hold. Nayla asked what she owed for such a gift. Vesa said gifts owed nothing, but a shrine with a working altar again would owe itself a keeper who stayed in it. Nayla said she had never left, not once since her mother died there. Vesa said that was, in her opinion, the correct answer to give a god. I told them both that whatever this was, it would not fill a stomach twice. Vesa said stomachs were my department. Then she looked pointedly at the ruined half of the loaf. By full light, Perrin Doak had heard about it from 2 women at the well. The Ost debt was struck clean off his own book, struck by a hand neither woman could put a name to. He came to the shrine himself with the ledger under his arm. He stood a long moment reading his own entry. Then he scratched it through with his own knife point. He gave no apology aloud. He did leave a second loaf on the broken wall on his way out. For a man like Perrin Doak, that came close enough to the same thing. By the end of that first day, I had a beam of my own, a rope no one could shorten, a client who paid in bread, and a god who ate a dram of it before I could stop her. I also had a debt of my own still standing, an ear that marked me before I opened my mouth, and a waymaster who knew my face now, with my father's rod locked in his toll box. As the light went long and orange over the broken wall, 3 men in guild gray came. They walked the boundary stones of the shrine's old plot, unspooling a measuring chain, link by link. They did not speak to Nayla or to me. They measured. They wrote in a small book. Then they left the chain coiled neat on the last stone, as though they meant to come back for it. Nayla watched them from the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself. She asked what a struck-off shrine could be worth. Worth, that is, to men who measure land for a living. I did not have an answer for her. I had the memory of a toll box shutting on my father's rod, and I had the certainty that Ostrin Vale did nothing in that county without pricing it first. A beam and a rope will tell a man the truth about a sack of grain, but neither one will fill the sack, and mine was empty by the second morning. I spent that morning unloading carts at the gate for Halder Pike, my arms in wet leather up to the elbow, and he paid me 4 bits for the work by midday. 4 bits bought 1 sack of the cheapest grain in Vetch Hollow, and the cheapest grain in Vetch Hollow was sold from a stall run by a trader named Cass Vero. Vero's scale hung from a post at the center of the row, its beam stamped fresh with Vale's own mark, and its arms did not look, to my eye, entirely equal. I did not say so aloud. A hungry man with no coin to spare does not pick fights with a scale, not on the first look, not with an empty stomach doing his thinking for him. Vero weighed my sack himself, called it 2 stone and 4 dram, took my 4 bits, and told me to come back when I had a real coin to spend instead of gate wages. I carried the sack home to the shrine and set it on my own beam, balanced against a counterweight stone I had matched by hand against Pike's own trade weights. My beam called the same sack 1 stone and 11 dram, a full third light of what I had paid for, and I sat with that difference for a long while before I moved again. Vesa, curled on the altar, opened one eye and said the sack had smelled short to her from across the room, and asked why I had not simply let her tell me sooner. I told her a god's nose was not proof a row of witnesses would accept, and she said that was, in her considerable experience, the exact problem with every honest god she had known. I went back to the market with the sack over my shoulder and my own beam under my arm, and Vero saw me coming before I reached his stall. He asked if I had come to buy again, and I said I had come to weigh again, on his scale. in front of whoever cared to watch me do it. His beam hung from a single iron post, 2 brass pans on chains, and a tongue that should have pointed dead center when the load and the counterweight agreed on the truth. I did not touch his beam. I only asked him to hang the sack from the near hook and the counterweight from the far hook, the ordinary way. And he did, because refusing would have looked worse. The scale read 2 stone and 4 dram, same as before, and Vero spread his hands at the row as if the number had settled the matter on its own. Then I asked him to swap them, sack to the far hook, counterweight to the near, the same 2 objects, only trading which arm carried which. He hesitated, and that hesitation was the loudest thing said in the row all morning, louder than either number the scale would go on to give. Swapped them anyway, because a row of eyes was watching him decide, and the beam settled at 1 stone and 11 dram, a full third short of his own first reading. The row fell silent. Everyone had watched the same sack produce 2 false numbers in opposite directions, and now they were waiting to see who would speak first. An old woman near the front said aloud that she had bought from this stall every week since spring, and began counting on her fingers how many sacks that made. Another voice picked up the count, and a third, until the row had settled on a rough tally between them, more households than fingers on both a man's hands. Vero said the scale had simply been knocked crooked by cart traffic, an accident of the road, nothing more sinister than a jolted post. I said an accident does not read short in exactly the same direction every single time a poor man's sack is weighed on it, and Vero had no number ready to answer that with. A guildman in gray stepped out from behind the flour sacks, the same gray I had seen measuring the shrine's boundary stones the evening before, and spoke up at last. He said flatly that hands other than a licensed weighmaster's had no right to touch a stamped beam, swapped hooks or not, and that the law took a hand for the offense. I answered that I had not touched the beam, only the 2 things hanging from it, and he said the guild's courts had never found that distinction worth the ink to write down. I said he was welcome to write down whatever he pleased, but the row had seen the swap with their own eyes, and no ink would unsee it for them. He did not answer that. He only looked at my ear, like Vale had looked at it, and walked back behind the flour sacks without another word. I watched him go and saw him cut sideways through the row, instead of staying at Vero's stall, heading straight for Austrin Vale's post at the market's far end. Whatever words passed between them at that distance, I could not hear. Vale's head turned once toward me, and did not turn away again for a long moment. I understood, standing there with a light sack and an honest beam, what I had just risked, and I did not step back from the scale to prove it to myself. Nayla had followed me from the shrine without my noticing, and she caught my sleeve now and asked, low enough for only me to hear, whether a hand was truly worth a sack of grain. I told her it was not the sack that mattered anymore. It was the number the row had just watched a stamped scale lie about, and a lie that size did not care what it cost to expose. She kept her hold on my sleeve. She did not pull me back either, and I took that for the closest thing to agreement a frightened woman had left to give. Vesa arrived partway through the shouting, carried in a market basket by Nayla, her head poking over the rim, sniffing the row like a hound working a scent. She announced, to no one in particular, that the turnip cart passing behind us was short a full turnip's worth of weight against its own posted price. The turnip seller heard her, went pale, and quietly added an extra turnip to the next 3 sales without being asked twice by anyone. Nayla told her under her breath to be quiet in a crowd this size, and Vesa said quiet had never once fed anyone, and continued commenting on a passing sack of onions. A woman I had not yet met pushed through the row toward Vero's stall, flour dust still pale on her forearms, and asked him outright how long he had been shorting her order too. She gave her name as Bettany Rusk, widow, keeper of the bread ovens on the north side of the row, and said her flour bill had never once matched her flour bin in 3 years. Vero told her the difference was spillage. Always spillage. And Bettany said spillage did not explain a shortfall that only ever ran in one man's favor. She turned to me and asked whether the same trick would work on the sacks her own supplier sent her, since her livelihood stood or fell on flour that weighed what it claimed to weigh. I told her I would test a week of her deliveries for nothing but the bread it cost to feed myself and Vesa, and see whether her supplier's numbers held up under the same swap. She looked at me as a woman looks at a tool she has not decided whether to trust yet, and said 1 week on trial and not a crumb more until she saw proof for herself. I asked what happened at the end of the week if her supplier's numbers held honest after all, and she said then I would have earned a loaf for nothing and lost nothing but my own time. I agreed, because one paying trial from a baker who fed half the row was worth more to me than 100 more minutes of shouting at Vero's stall. By the time the row's attention at last turned away from us, 3 separate stall keepers had quietly stopped sending their custom toward Vero's scale for the day. An old man selling twine said he would rather walk the extra distance to the far stall than hand his coin to a beam that had just lied twice in front of witnesses. Someone worked out the sum aloud before I could stop them, counting 11 households against 9 months of weekly sacks, and named a figure in drams that made even Vero flinch. 11 households, shorted by roughly the same third every week for 9 months, came to more grain than Vero's own stall had likely sold honestly in that whole span. Vero did not deny the number. He only said the guild set his weights, not him, and that anyone with a complaint about the stamp should carry it to the stamp's owner. A voice at the edge of the row, sharp and carrying, said loudly that grain thieves always found someone else to blame once the scale turned against them. I turned to find a woman with a stall of her own 2 lots down, weight stacked high and gleaming, who introduced herself as Wooletta Fen before I could ask. She said she sold honest weight and always had, generous weight even, and that men like me who went looking for crooked scales would find their own dinner crooked by winter for the trouble. I asked what a warning like that was worth from a woman selling weights that looked, to my eye, a hair heavier than the stamp on them claimed. She said nothing to that, only smiled thin and moved off through the row, and I marked her as I had marked Vero, a name to weigh again later. By mid-afternoon, the row had mostly returned to its ordinary noise, sacks and coin and gossip, though the gossip now ran mostly toward the shrine and the branded man who had come to it. Wooletta Fen found me again before I left, this time with no crowd to perform for, and said softly that a branded man who made enemies of waymasters rarely lived to see his own harvest. I asked her whether that was advice or a second warning, and she said in her stall the 2 words meant the same thing, and that I would learn the difference by winter whether I liked it or not. Bettany found me again near the well, and said she had heard, from 2 different mouths already, that a small creature had ridden into market in a basket announcing turnip weights. I told her the creature had opinions about everyone's honesty and very few manners to go with them, and Bettany laughed, which she had not once done since I met her that morning. She said 1 week starting tomorrow, her first delivery came at dawn, and that I had better be there before the cart or not bother coming at all. As the light began to lean west, a man in a bailiff's gray coat walked the length of the row at an unhurried pace, hands clasped behind his back, and stopped opposite Vero's stall. He looked at the scale, looked at me, looked at the crowd still lingering near the swapped hooks, and said nothing to any of us for the length of several long breaths. I had no name for him yet, only his coat. He stood apart from the noise, sorting the crowd face by face into those worth arresting and those merely worth remembering. He crossed close enough that I could see the county crest stitched small on his collar, and closer still he paused, studied the swapped hook still hanging from Vero's post, and said nothing at all. He turned without a word and walked back as he had come, and the row let out a breath together once his back had cleared the last stall. I had my father's rod still locked in a toolbox I had not touched, a light sack of grain in my hand, and a trial with a baker starting before the next sunrise. I also had now a name in a bailiff's memory and a debt of hands owed under a law I had broken without laying a finger on a single stamped beam. Word of a swapped scale travels faster than any cart in Vetch Hollow, and by the 3rd morning people were finding me before I finished Bettany's flour count. None of them had coin. A man offered me a chipped hoe to weigh his neighbor's fence posts against a disputed boundary. A woman offered me half a chicken to settle an argument about wool. A boy no older than 10 tugged my sleeve and asked, very seriously, whether I could tell him if his mother's rent jar was really as empty as she kept saying it was. An old cobbler wanted his own scales checked against his rivals, mostly, I suspected, so he could gloat, rather than because either scale had ever wronged him. I told most of them the same thing, that I would look when I had eaten, and that looking for a chicken was fair pay, but looking for a promise was not. There was almost no coin left circulating honestly in Vetch Hollow that season, and every dispute in the row had begun to sound the same underneath its details. Someone certain they had been shorted and no way to prove it without me. Bettany's flour, every morning of that trial so far, came in true, dram for dram, and she paid me in bread each time as she had promised, though she still watched me count it twice before she trusted her own supplier. The fish stalls near the well, a broad man named Wick Tally was telling anyone who would listen that the branded stranger had gotten lucky once and would not get lucky twice. He said his own scale was honest, that he had weighed fish on it for 11 years, and that he would put a full week's takings against my nerve if I dared to test it in front of the row. I said I would test whatever he liked, and asked what a fisherman without much coin planned to wager against a week's takings he did not actually have to spare. His answer was that he had something better than coin. He had his own name, and he would let the entire row watch me fail to find a single fault in his scale or his catch. Crowd gathered fast around his stall like crowds gather around any two men who have just agreed, loudly, to disagree in public. I checked his weights first, one against another, as Pike had taught me without meaning to, stacking them in pairs to see which pair leaned. His scale, when I checked it, hung true and level, arms equal, weights matched to the stamp, honest work by an honest man, and I told him so in front of everyone watching. Tally grinned wide enough to show a missing tooth, and said that settled it. The branded man was wrong once, and started to turn back to his stall. Before he could leave, I pointed to the coin pouch at his belt. The fish were honest. The silver he had paid his suppliers with all week was the next thing I wanted tested. He said his coin was honestly earned, and none of my business. Bodies shifted closer around him. The row knew the argument had only moved from the scale to the silver. An old woman behind me said, not quietly at all, that a man who guarded his coin that hard from a simple look usually had a reason worth hearing. Tally heard her too, and his face moved from pride toward the beginning of doubt, though his mouth kept arguing a moment longer out of habit. I asked to borrow 1 jug of water and 1 coin from his pouch, a small enough thing to grant someone who had just proven his own scale honest, and he handed both over more out of pride than caution. Marked a line on the jug at the water's level, dropped his coin in, and marked the new line where the water rose to meet it, and asked the row to remember both marks. Then I did the same with a coin Bettany offered from her own apron, a coin she swore was full silver, weighed the same on Tally's honest scale as his own. 2 coins, the same weight on his scale to the last grain, and 2 very different rises in the same jug of water. And I asked the row which of those 2 facts they trusted more. Tally said weight was weight, and I said weight was only half of what a coin was, that the other half was what it was made of, and water did not care about a stamp, only about volume. His coin displaced more water than Bettany's for the same weight, which meant it held less silver and more of something cheaper mixed in to fill the difference. I asked him to look at the 2 marks on the jug himself, not to take my word for either of them. And he leaned over the water with a fisherman's squint until even he could not argue with what his own eyes measured. I told him flatly that his own coin was debased by a small margin, and that margin was enough, and that a fish scale could be perfectly honest while the coin paying for the fish was not. Someone in the crowd asked how much silver a small difference like that actually meant across a whole season of fish sold at the going rate, and I said probably enough to matter and not enough to notice on any single sale. He went very quiet, turned the coin over in his fingers, and asked where in every name of the honest gods a fisherman was supposed to have picked up bad silver without ever noticing. I said that was not a question I could answer from a jug of water, only that he had likely been paying it out again to every supplier who took it from him without checking either. An older woman near the fish stalls said, loud enough for the row to hear, that she had taken a coin from Tally just that morning that had looked and felt exactly the same. Tally's face went through several colors in quick succession, and then, to his credit, he did not shout at me or at her. He asked instead whether the trick would work on any coin, not only his. I told him it would work on any coin against any other coin of known weight, silver against silver, copper against copper, so long as the water and the scale stayed honest. He said then that his own father-in-law had paid him with a whole handful of coin not 2 days past, and demanded I test that handful too, right there, before the row dispersed. I asked why his father-in-law's coin mattered more than his own embarrassment already sitting in his palm, and Tally said outright that he did not intend to be the only fool caught that morning. The row laughed at that, not unkindly, and someone fetched the father-in-law's coin from Tally's own strongbox, while the crowd waited with the particular patience of people enjoying a free show. 2 of the 5 coins from that handful displaced water wrong, same as Tally's, and the row's laughter turned into a different kind of muttering entirely. Tally thanked me for it, and then, without any prompting from me, he began addressing me with the formal "you" a man uses for someone he has decided to respect rather than merely tolerate. He said he would send fish to the shrine twice a week from now on, paid honestly, if I would test every coin that crossed his stall from that day forward before he passed any of it along. I agreed, because a standing arrangement with a fishmonger who trusted my nose for bad silver was worth more to a hungry man than any single week's takings he might have won on a wager. Willetta Fenn had been watching the entire exchange from her own stall, arms crossed over her stacked weight. weights. And when the crowd's attention at last drifted toward her, she did not let it drift far. She announced, unprompted, that a district this careless with its coin and its scales was a district already halfway into winter starvation, and that she had said as much for the third time now. Perrin Doak, the bread seller who had once thrown Nayla from his own table, spoke up from behind his loaves and said he, for one, would welcome such a test, given how the season had gone lately. Someone in the row asked her, not gently, whether her own weights had been checked lately, since a woman so quick to prophesy hunger for others rarely welcomed the same test on herself. She said her weights carried the guild stamp same as anyone's, and that was answer enough for any honest customer, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty saying it. A customer who had bought from her every week for a year walked past her stall without stopping, which I had never seen, and 2 more followed him before the hour was out. By afternoon, her corner of the row sat emptier than I had ever seen it, and she watched the traffic pass her by with the flat expression of a woman doing arithmetic she did not like the answer to. Vesa, still riding in the basket, announced across the gap between us that Woletta's own smallest weight read a full grain heavy against its stamp, loud enough that 3 passing women turned their heads to look. Woletta answered the accusation of a talking creature in a basket with silence alone, which told the row more than any denial would have managed. Nayla found me near the well and said quietly that 11 households from the earlier tally had sent word through the row that they did not intend to pay Vero's toll again this season. She said the number had started as a count of who Vero had cheated, and had turned in less than 2 days into a count of who no longer feared him enough to keep paying. I told her that a number like that would reach Vale's ears within the hour, if it had not already, and Nayla said it likely had, given how quiet Vale's stall had gone since mid-morning. I walked past Vale's post on my way back from the fish stalls and found it empty. No toll box open, no line of customers, only a boy minding the scale and telling anyone who asked that the master had business elsewhere. I asked the boy where elsewhere was, mostly out of habit, like a tallyman asks questions even when he expects no honest answer back. He said, without much thought behind it, that the master had gone toward the tannery on the west road and went back to minding the scale before I could ask him why. I knew no one in Vetch Hollow who owned a tannery, only that leather meant hides, and hides meant the same ringing and charring trick that had first bought me bread at the gate. Vesa, riding in Nayla's basket again, said the tannery smelled of trouble even from this distance, and for once I did not argue with her nose over the matter. Neither of us knew what business a weighmaster had with a tanner, on a day he had otherwise avoided his own scale entirely, and neither of us liked not knowing it. Nayla asked whether a man like Vale ever did anything without pricing it first, and I said I had not yet seen him move a single step that did not end in someone else paying for it. She said that was what frightened her about the silence, and I found I had no honest answer that would have made either of us feel any safer walking home. I had, by the day's end, a fishmonger who called me you, instead of whatever a stranger's brand had earned him before, a baker's trial half proven, and 11 households who no longer paid a toll out of fear alone. I also had a weighmaster who had walked away from his own post without a word, toward a tanner none of us had met yet, and a district too quiet where his silence usually sat. By the 4th day, the row had more work for me than I had hours to give it, and every extra hour meant one more dawn where Vesa needed honest food I had not yet earned. A boy no taller than my elbow fell into step beside me near the well, and named a price before he even said good morning, as I would soon learn was simply his manner. Said his name was Onder Vane, that he watched the full row for a living, and that anything I wanted to know about who carried what and when cost 1 meal, paid in advance. I admitted I had no coin and barely enough bread for myself, and he said meals counted the same whether they came from a purse or a loaf, and that I clearly had a loaf. A woman with rope coiled over both shoulders stopped in front of us before I could answer him, and introduced herself with her hands already spread to show a length in the air. She gave her name as Trice Amberley, rope maker, and said a tanner named Bo Skell wanted a large batch of hides certified true weight before he would pay full price for them. Her answer was that she had told Skell she knew an honest man for the work, meaning me, and that her own name now stood behind mine whether I liked the arrangement or not. I asked why a tanner needed my word instead of his own scale, and Trice said Skell's buyer no longer trusted Skell's own numbers, not since the row had learned to ask questions. I agreed to the work because a rope maker's trust and a tanner's coin together were worth more than a week of chicken halves and disputed fence posts. Trice measured the job for me with her own hands, spreading them wide to show the size of the bundle, then narrower to show what a fair fee for the checking ought to look like. She said she had never once been cheated on rope length herself, not since she started stamping her own coils with a mark no one else in the district could copy. I asked how a rope maker came to know a tanner well enough to vouch for a stranger to him, and she said Skell bought her cord by the bale to bind his hides for shipping, and paid on time, which in this district counted as a rare virtue. Skell met me behind his tannery yard the next morning, a heavy man with hands stained permanently the color of old bark, and offered me coin before I had touched a single hide. He said the count would go easier for everyone if I simply named the number he expected, and took the coin as thanks for my time. No scale needed at all. My answer was that I did not sell numbers I had not weighed, and that if his hides were honest, they had nothing to fear from an honest count either. He looked at me a long moment, put the coin back in his own pocket, and said very well. Then, in a voice that gave away nothing about what he intended to do next, I asked why an honest tanner would offer a stranger coin just to skip an honest count, and he said generosity was simply his nature, and smiled in a way that matched neither word. The smile earned no trust from me. I had no proof yet of anything worse than a man being strange with his own money, and strangeness alone had never fed Vesa a single meal. Skell's yard smelled of lime and old hide. Rows of stretched skins hung drying under open sheds, and every worker in sight kept their eyes down whenever their master passed. Onder was still trailing me that morning, uninvited, and as Skell walked off to fetch the sample bundle, Onder tugged my sleeve and said something worth knowing, for a price. I told him there was no time and no coin for riddles, that dawn was close, and Vesa needed feeding, and he said fine, then, free this once. But he would remember I owed him. He said the sack Skell's man was carrying toward us now was not the same sack a different hand had carried out of the tannery yesterday evening. Wrong color cord at the neck. I asked how a boy who spent his mornings chasing meals kept track of cord colors on sacks that were none of his business. Watching was the only trade he owned, he said, and hunger had made him good at it. I heard him. But dawn was close, my stomach was empty, and Vesa still needed feeding. I treated the warning as one more delay instead of my last chance to stop a swindle. Skell's man set the sample down between us and stood waiting, and the sun had already climbed higher than I liked, and every minute spent doubting a boy's memory of cord color was a minute Vesa's dawn had not asked me to spend. I told myself a cord's color proved nothing, that boys who sold information sometimes sold guesses dressed as certainty, and I took the offered sample without asking whose hand had tied it. The sample hide felt right under my fingers, cured evenly. No thin patches, no hidden tears. The quality a buyer would expect from Skell's usual work. I weighed it against my own beam, checked its thickness with a folded measure, and declared the whole batch true to the sample, worth the full price Trice's buyer had offered. Skell thanked me, paid me fairly, and I went home that evening with enough coin for a proper meal and enough pride, briefly, to believe the day had gone well. The buyer's own men opened the full bundle 2 days later, in front of half the row, and found hides thinner and patchier than anything I had put my name to. Onder gave me the entire scene secondhand within the hour, breathless and bright-eyed, having watched it from the edge of the crowd. By his account, one of the buyer's men held a ruined hide up over his head so every stall in the row could see the thin patches catching the light, and asked loudly whose name stood behind a count this wrong. Another answered him before I ever arrived, and said the branded strangers, the one who had caught a fisherman's bad silver not 5 days past, as if that made the failure harder to believe rather than easier. Word came back to Trice before it came back to me, and by the time I reached her stall, she already knew, from the buyer's own mouth, that the certified batch and the sold batch did not match. She asked me quietly how a stranger who had caught a fisherman's bad coin from across a jug of water could miss an entire mismatched shipment standing right in front of him. I told her the sample I had tested was true, and the batch that shipped was not, and that meant someone had switched what I was shown after I had already sworn to it. She said that explanation cost her the order regardless of whether it was true, because her name, not Skell's, was the one the buyer had trusted enough to bring the work to me at all. The buyer withdrew the contract entirely, and took his custom to a tannery 2 villages over, and Trice stood to lose by her own count, near 40 marks she did not have to spare. She did not shout at me. She only sat down on her own coil of rope, spread her hands to measure nothing in particular, and said 40 marks was 2 winters of flour for a household her size. I offered to work the debt off however she needed, testing every fathom she sold from now on for free. and she said an apology measured in future labor still left the current winter unpaid for. I asked Onder later why he had not simply grabbed my arm and made me listen instead of naming a price for a warning I clearly had no time to buy. He told me he had learned young that free warnings got ignored twice as often as paid ones, and that a price at least made a man stop and think for half a breath before walking past it. I told him that half a breath had cost Trice 40 marks, and he looked, in a way I had never seen from him before, genuinely sorry rather than merely clever. That night at the shrine, Vesa sat up on the altar stone, sniffed the air in the direction of the tannery, and announced that the sample I had certified 2 days ago had been a full third lighter than the batch it claimed to represent. I told her that information would have been considerably more useful before I put my name to it than after Trice had already lost her contract over it. She admitted with unmistakable pride that timing had never been her strongest gift, then asked whether any bread remained to make up for it. I sat with the wreck of the day a while longer and understood, finally, what Onder's warning and Vesa's nose and my own hurry all pointed at from 3 different directions. Sample could be honest and still lie, if the hand that carried it to me was not the same hand that would carry the goods to the buyer afterward. I decided, from that night forward, that I would accept no sample from anyone but the owner's own hand, in front of a witness who could later swear to whose hand it had been. Onder asked whether that rule would have cost him his fee the day before, since strictly speaking, he had only warned me about a hand, not carried the sample himself. I told him the rule was for goods, not for warnings, and that his fee still stood owed, and he said that was, in his professional opinion, an entirely fair distinction. I found Skell the next morning at his own gate and told him plainly in front of 2 of his workers that I now knew the sample had been switched and that I intended everyone in the row to know it too. He did not deny it outright. He only said that a man who refused an easy payment should expect the world to grow harder around him afterward, and turned back into his yard. I made certain, before the day was over, that Trice, Bettany, Tally, and half the fish stalls had heard whose hand had swapped the sample, and why. Trice thanked me for that much, at least, though it bought back none of the 40 marks, and said a ruined name repaired quickly counted for more in this row than most people gave it credit for. Late that afternoon, Ostrin Vale returned to his own stall for the first time since his visit to the tannery, and called out across the row for anyone within earshot to stop and listen. He announced, loudly enough for every stall to hear, that he would hold a stamping day at the week's end to certify every scale and weight in the district against the guild's own standard. Then he looked directly at me, across the whole width of the row, and said he expected the branded stranger to attend as well, since a man so fond of testing others' honesty ought to enjoy having his own tested in return. The row went quiet around me, as it had gone quiet twice already since I arrived, and I understood that whatever Vale had learned from Skell, it had not made him afraid of me at all. Nayla, walking home beside me afterward, asked what a man like Vale gained by inviting his rival to watch him prove his own scales flawless in front of the entire district. I said I did not yet know, only that Vale had never once done anything in this row that did not end with someone else paying for the privilege of watching him win. She asked whether that someone would be me this time, and I told her I intended to find out on my own feet, at the stamping day, rather than guess at it from a shrine with a broken roof. 3 days stood between me and the stamping day, and I spent the first of them mending my reputation one honest way at a time, like a man mends a net, knot by small knot. Word reached me at mid-morning that Halder Pike's whole cargo train sat stopped dead at the county gate, oxen and all, and that the guild wardens had refused to let a single cart through. I left Bettany's flour half-counted and walked the road to the gate myself, because Pike had fed me my first honest meal in this district, and a debt like that does not wait politely. The gate stood jammed with carts 3 deep, drovers shouting, and Pike himself standing square in front of his lead ox with his arms folded like a man who had already decided how his day would end. The head warden, a different man from the one who had once weighed his rain-soaked hides, told him flatly that no cargo weighed by an unlicensed hand could pass without a special toll first. Pike asked what made a hand unlicensed when the weight it gave had proven truer than the guild's own scale 3 separate times already this month. The warden said the law did not care whose weight was truer, only whose stamp was on the paper, and that Vale's office had issued the toll order that very morning. I asked whether the order named Pike specifically, or simply any cargo that had passed through my hands since the pan swap, and the warden looked uncomfortable enough that I already knew the answer. He admitted after a moment that the order used the words any goods weighed outside a licensed beam, which in a district this size meant exactly one man's hands and no one else's. I asked to see the order myself, and the warden produced a slip bearing Vale's mark, demanding a full toll on any goods not weighed under a licensed beam before reaching the gate. Pike said he would pay no toll for a lie about weight. His own eyes and my own beam had already proven honest, and he walked his lead ox sideways until it stood square across the gateway. The ox did not move again after that, no matter how the warden shouted, and behind Pike's cart the queue began to grow. Cart after cart, all of them going nowhere. I asked the warden whether he intended to unload every single cart in that queue by hand to check each one's weighing hand, since the order as written applied to all of them equally. He did not answer that directly, only repeated that the toll stood until paid, and I answered that I would settle the question of Pike's weight myself, right there, in front of everyone waiting. I built a fire from cart straw, same as I had at this very gate on my first morning in the district, and asked Pike's own drivers to bring down the sacks nearest the front for testing. I wrung a scrap from the wettest-looking sack, charred it against a dry scrap from one already weighed honest, and set both on a borrowed scale for the whole queue to see. The two scraps weighed the same, dry against dry, as they had the first time I ever did this trick at this same gate, and I said so loudly enough to carry down the line of carts. A woman 3 carts back climbed down from her seat to watch, and asked how long the guild intended to hold healthy commerce hostage over a toll invented that same morning. Another driver further back shouted that he had a full day's spoilage riding in his own cart, fish packed in salt that would not wait out an argument about paperwork. A third voice, further back still, said he recognized me from the fish stalls and asked whether this was the same branded man who had caught Tally's bad silver, since if so, he trusted my scale over the guild's without needing to see it first. The queue began on its own to count aloud what the delay was costing each of them. A few bits here, a half day's custom there, until the sum of it hung over the gate louder than any single voice. Someone near the middle of the line worked the running total out on their fingers and called it forward, cart by cart, until the warden himself could hear what his toll was costing the district by the hour. The warden looked from the growing crowd to Pike's unmoving ox and back again, and I could see the exact moment he understood that no order from Vale's office was going to move that animal for him. Pike told him outright that the ox would stand there until the toll was withdrawn, or until the beast starved rather than move for a lie, and oxen, in my experience, keep their word better than most men. By midday the queue stretched past sight around the bend in the road, and 3 separate drivers had climbed down to add their own sacks to my growing pile of tested goods. I charred and weighed every sample they brought me, one after another, and every single one came back honest, a fact the warden could no longer pretend not to have heard. A boy ran the news back into the market row faster than I could have carried it myself, and by early afternoon half the row had walked out to the gate just to watch the standoff for themselves. Perrin Doak arrived among them, flour still on his hands from his own ovens, and stood near the front of the crowd with his arms crossed in an expression I had not seen on him before. He said, to no one in particular, loud enough for the warden to hear, that a bread row paying tribute to a stamp that could not even move one stubborn ox was paying tribute to nothing at all. Another baker beside him agreed, and within the hour, word passed down the row that every stall on the bread side had quietly agreed among themselves to stop sending coin to the guild's toll box entirely. The warden sent a runner toward Vale's stall sometime past noon, and the runner came back alone, without Vale, without any new order, only a shrug that told the whole queue everything it needed to know. By the 4th hour, the warden's own superiors had clearly abandoned him to the problem, and he stood alone at a gate he no longer had the will or the authority to hold closed. He wiped his face with his sleeve, looked back down the impossible length of the queue, and asked me directly whether I intended to keep charring scraps until every last cart had cleared or the sun went down first. I answered that I intended to keep going until the toll was gone or the road was clear. Whichever the guild decided came cheaper for them to lose. He at last announced, to the queue and to Pike both, that the toll was withdrawn for want of clear proof, and that the gate would open the moment the ox agreed to move. Pike walked up to his own lead ox, said something low and private into its ear, and the animal stepped aside as calmly as it had planted itself hours before, as though the whole standoff had been the ox's idea all along. The queue cheered, and not for Pike, and not for me either. They cheered for the sheer relief of carts rolling forward after half a day standing still in the dust. Pike found me once his own cargo had cleared the gate, and said that half a day risking his whole team deserved more than a loaf of bread and a handshake going forward. I asked what he had in mind instead, and he said a real share, a stake in whatever this was becoming, since he had put his oxen and his custom on the line, same as I had put my name. I told him a share sounded fair, provided he understood the arrangement came with no guild stamp behind it, only the same honest weight we had both been proving all along. He said a stamp had never once fed his oxen, and that a partner willing to stand in front of a queue and char scraps for half a day had earned more trust from him than any licensed beam ever had. We shook on it there at the gate, no paper between us, only his hand and mine, and a queue of witnesses still rolling past who had watched the whole arrangement get made in the open. We settled the first mark of clean profit that evening, counted openly in front of Bettany and Trice both. The toll saved on Pike's cargo, alone worth more than either of us had held at once since I arrived in the district. Trice, watching the coin counted out, said this was the first number all week that had made her believe 40 marks lost might one day be 40 marks recovered. Bettany said the Bread Rose decision to stop paying the guild had already reached every stall on her side of the market, and that Perrin Doak of all people had been the one to carry the word fastest. I asked her whether she trusted a decision made in the heat of a standoff to hold once the heat cooled, and she said Bread Rose remembered exactly one thing longer than fear, and that thing was money saved. She said her own oven alone had paid the guild more in toll over 3 years than the oven itself had cost to build, and that a single afternoon watching an ox humiliate the whole guild had done more to change minds than 3 years of her own complaining ever had. Onder appeared at my elbow sometime during the counting, uninvited as always, and said this particular piece of news was worth remembering for free, since he expected it would feed him for weeks once it spread past the row. Vessa, who had watched the whole standoff from Nayla's basket at a safe distance from the shouting, announced that the ox in question had, in her professional opinion, more honest weight in its own hooves than most men in the guild. Nayla laughed until she had to wipe her eyes. Only then did I realize how much fear she had carried since morning without saying a word. As the last carts cleared the gate and the light went long across the road, a single rider came through from the direction of the provincial highway, unhurried, dressed for distance rather than trade. No one in the queue recognized him, and he did not stop at a single stall, did not ask after lodging, did not so much as glance at the ox that had held the gate all day. He rode straight through Vetch Hollow and out along the road toward the provincial capital, and the warden, of everyone present, was the only one who watched him go with anything like recognition on his face. I asked the warden who the rider was, and he said only that he did not know the man himself, only the look of someone carrying a message too important to stop and eat on the way. He said he had seen that same look on riders twice before in his years at this gate, both times in the week, before something in the district changed hands that had stood unchanged for a generation. Ike said, half joking, that a district this small rarely earned messages worth that kind of hurry, and none of us standing at the gate that evening managed much of an answer to that either. I watched the dust settle behind the rider long after he had passed out of sight, and thought of Vale's stamping day still waiting 2 days off, and wondered which of the two events the rider's message actually concerned. Vessa turned her nose up at the grain I brought her that dawn, sniffed it twice, and announced that honestly measured did not mean the same thing as fit for a god's table. I told her a god in a broken shrine had no business being particular about the color of her porridge, and she said particularity was the last dignity a forgotten god had left to keep. She wanted white grain, not the gray husked leavings the district's own supply had thinned down to, and she said so at length in the tone of a customer haggling a stall-keeper down on price. I asked where in Vetch Hollow she expected me to find white grain, when half the county was still eating whatever the guild's crooked scales had left behind after 200 years of shorting. She said she did not care where, only that a god who ate porridge fit for a beggar would go on being remembered as a beggar's god, and that struck me as the first honest complaint she had made that was actually about herself. I asked what counted as fit, since I had no wish to spend a week chasing a standard she refused to name plainly, and she listed white grain, a proper grind, and a bowl that had not once held someone else's leftovers. I told her the bowl, at least, I could manage before dawn, and she said the bowl had never been the problem, only my patience for finding the rest. Nayla, listening from the doorway, said there was a caravan factor the better part of a hard day's travel out on the eastern road. A man named Fen Oduva, who bought and sold grain verified clean by weight before it ever touched a wagon. I decided that morning to walk the road and see him myself, since a trial delivery from an outside source would feed Vessa properly and give the venture something the district's own thin supply could not. Pike lent me one of his smaller carts and a single ox for the trip, and said a shareholder who stayed home while his partner walked a hard road on foot was no kind of shareholder at all, and came along himself. We reached the first toll gate on the eastern road by mid-afternoon, a wooden barrier manned by 2 guild toll takers with a scale bolted to a post like every other scale I had learned to distrust. The tollman weighed our empty cart, called it heavier than any empty cart had a right to be, and demanded a toll based on a phantom weight that existed nowhere but on his own crooked beam. I asked to see the counterweight stones themselves, and found one of them hollowed underneath and packed with lead shot, heavier than its own stamped face claimed by a clean quarterstone. The toll man did not deny it. Once I showed the row of waiting travelers the hollow, only shrugged and said every gate on every road ran the same trick, and that complaining changed nothing this far from any market that cared. I paid him the honest toll for an honest empty cart, and told him flatly I would remember his gate on the way back, and he said plenty of men had promised him that before, and none had ever followed through. Pike asked, once we were clear of the barrier, whether every road in the county ran on the same hollow stone trick, and I said I doubted the guild had bothered inventing two different lies when one worked everywhere equally well. He said that was, in its own ugly way, almost impressive, and I told him impressive was not the word I would have chosen for a stone that had likely cost 100 travelers a season's worth of honest coin. He had not gone another mile before I heard footsteps behind us that did not belong to Pike's ox, and turned to find Onder Vane trotting to catch up, uninvited, dust already on his shoes. I asked how a boy who watched the row for a living had followed us so far from home without either of us noticing, and he said watching people who did not expect to be watched was the whole of his trade. He explained that he had come along on his own account, not for pay, because the district's whole future business was riding on whatever deal I struck with this Oduva, and a smart informant invested ahead of the news rather than after it. I told him this was not a market row, he could work for meals, and he said he intended to earn his keep scouting the caravan camp itself before I ever walked in and let them see my face. He slipped ahead of us that evening while Pike and I made camp, and returned past midnight with a full account of Oduva's guards, his temper, and the exact hour he preferred to hear new offers. He named his price for the information plainly, 1 full share of whatever grain we brought home, and I told him a boy who had just walked that hard road uninvited had more than earned it, and did not need to ask twice. Armed with what Onder had learned, I approached Oduva's camp the next morning, at the hour his own scouts had named as his best mood, rather than simply arriving whenever the road happened to deliver me. Oduva was a lean, watchful man surrounded by ledgers rather than soldiers, and he looked me over like a man looks over a horse he suspects has been dressed up to hide a limp. He said he had heard rumors out of Vetch Hollow about a branded stranger who caught crooked scales, and asked bluntly what that reputation was worth to him in marks, since reputations alone did not move grain. I let him know I could verify any shipment he sent into the district honest, weight for weight, and that an honest reputation in a district full of guild toll cheats was worth the custom he was currently losing to safer routes. He asked how much custom, precisely, and I named the 11 households and the whole bread row who had already stopped paying guild toll, and watched him do the sum in his head before I finished speaking. He admitted he did not care about honesty for its own sake, only about risk, and that a single short shipment lost to a bad market was worth more to him than 100 honest words from a stranger. I told him a trial shipment, small enough to risk little, verified by my own beam on delivery, would cost him nothing but the grain itself if my word turned out worthless. He considered that a long moment, tapping one ledger with 2 fingers, and said a man who offered to lose first rather than demand payment first was either honest or a very patient kind of fool. I told him he was welcome to decide which once the trial card arrived, and his own scale agreed with mine, since talk had never once moved a single sack of grain in either of our experience. He almost smiled at that, the closest thing to warmth I saw cross his face the whole visit, and said a man who valued proof over talk was, in his experience, rare enough to be worth the small risk of 1 cart. He agreed to a trial delivery, 1 cart's worth, verified on both ends, with the promise of a standing arrangement if the weight matched his own count to the dram when it arrived. Pike shook on the arrangement with him as he had shaken on our own partnership at the gate days before. No paper, only 2 hands, and Onder standing as a named witness to the terms. We loaded the cart with grain whiter and cleaner than anything I had seen since arriving in Vetch Hollow, and I set my own beam to it twice before we ever left Oduva's camp. Dram matching dram both times. The road home passed through the same crooked toll gate, and this time, I made the tollman weigh our loaded cart on his own hollow counterweight, while half the returning travelers from the first crossing watched. He tried to charge the same phantom quarterstone again, and I held up the hollow stone itself, where every traveler waiting at the barrier could see the lead shot packed inside it. The travelers refused to pay until he weighed honest, and rather than lose an entire afternoon's toll to a growing crowd, he at last swapped in a true stone and let us all through at the correct weight. We reached the shrine by evening of the second day, and I set the first measure of white grain before Vesa myself. Ground fine, the quality she had demanded at dawn 2 mornings before. She ate slowly and licked the last grain from the bowl, before admitting, grudgingly, that a god occasionally got what she asked for in this district. Onder arrived the next morning at the shrine, and this time not to collect his usual meal. He came to ask formally whether the venture had room for a boy who could organize other boys as he organized himself. I told him he had already proven he could scout a stranger's camp far from home without being caught, and that a venture growing as fast as ours needed that kind of eyes and ears working ahead of it. He recruited 3 other boys from the row within the day, younger than himself, and announced that they would answer to him and he would answer to me, a chain of command he seemed prouder of than any coin. I asked whether he still intended to charge for every piece of news his new little office produced, and he said naturally, though friends and shareholders would always get the family rate. By that afternoon, word of Oduva's trial contract had spread through the row, and Bettany said outside grain let us promise more than the district's thin stores could supply. The good feeling lasted less than a full day. Word came at dusk that Merrick Sold, the district's own bailiff, had ridden to the market gate himself and ordered it barred shut until the guild's toll arrears were paid in full. I had never met the man. In the row, people said his name without emphasis and then looked over his shoulder, as if even fear might attract his attention. Nayla said Sold commanded 8 men with clubs and the only key to the market gate's lock, and that unlike Vale, he had never once needed a scale to make a point stick. She said her mother used to warn her, when she was small, that a district could survive a dishonest weighmaster far longer than it could survive a bailiff who had stopped caring what the law actually said. I asked whether Sud answered to Vale or stood apart from him, and Nayla said no one in the row had ever managed to work out which, and that the not knowing was its own kind of danger. I walked to the gate myself that evening, and found it barred as reported, a length of chain through the hasp, and Sold's own men standing either side of it with no particular hurry in their stance. They did not speak to me, only watched me look at the chain as a man looks at a debt he has not yet decided how he intends to pay. Pike, beside me, said a locked gate could not be swayed by a stubborn ox this time, since Sold's men looked considerably less patient than any warden we had faced so far. I replied that I had no plan to test that patience tonight, only to understand what the guild believed it was still owed, and by whom, before the stamping day arrived and doubled every debt at once. The market gate stayed chained through the night, and by morning, 3 separate carts of spoiling produce sat rotting in the sun outside it, their owners shouting themselves hoarse at men who did not care. I went to find Merrick. Sold myself rather than wait for him to find me, because a district losing money every hour deserved better than a stranger hiding behind a shrine wall while it happened. I found him at the square instead, already waiting, as though he had known which direction I would come from before I chose it myself. He said the gate would open the moment the guild's toll arrears were settled in full, and that in the meantime he intended to settle a smaller matter first, concerning a branded man's own presumption of short weighing. 2 of his men had me in the wooden stocks before I finished asking what that meant. Wrists and neck locked between the boards, my knees bent at an angle that made standing straight impossible. So had hung a board over my bent shoulders himself, painted crude and fast, naming a false weight against my name, as though the brand on my ear were not accusation enough on its own. He said I would sit there the full day, for the district to see what became of men who touched other people's scales, and then he walked off without waiting to see whether I answered. My hands were locked, but nothing in the stocks had taken my voice, and as the first cart rolled past the square, I called out its weight and its price both, loud enough to carry across the open ground. A sack of turnips, I said, 40 pounds if it was an ounce, sold this morning for twice what turnips fetched last season. And the difference is what the guild toll adds before a single turnip reaches a table. The cart driver slowed despite himself, surprised to hear his own cargo priced aloud by a man locked in the stocks, and someone in the gathering crowd laughed at the sheer strangeness of it. A barrel of salted fish came next. Tally's own mark burned into the wood, and I called its weight from memory, since I had tested that exact barrel myself not 3 days past. A woman carrying 2 chickens by the feet walked by, and I named their combined weight close enough that she stopped mid-step to ask how I had guessed it, without so much as touching them. I told her 6 years of counting army rations taught a man to read weight by eye alone, and she laughed and told the next 3 people she passed what the man in the stocks had done. I did not stop with 1 cart. I called the next, and the next. Weight and price, and the toll skimmed off each one, until the numbers began to string together into something the square could follow. Bettany arrived within the hour, flowers still pale on her hands, and stood near enough to check my numbers against her own kept accounts, correcting me once, loudly, when I undercounted a flower delivery by half a stone. Under appeared soon after, out of breath, and reported the exact count of carts still backed up at the chained gate, a number that grew every time he ran back to check it and returned to update the tally. By his third trip, he had recruited one of his own boys to stay permanently at the gate and simply count, freeing himself to run the numbers back and forth without losing his own breath entirely. He announced each new gate count like a herald announces a verdict, chin up, voice pitched to carry, clearly enjoying the small authority of being the one number the whole square waited on. By midday, the square had a rhythm to it, my voice naming each load as it passed, Bettany checking the ones she knew best, Onder running fresh numbers from the gate every quarter hour like a boy twice his size. Sold's men stood either side of the stocks the entire time, arms crossed, clearly under orders to silence me if I said anything treasonous, and finding nothing treasonous in a man simply naming what things weighed. One of them, a broad-faced man with tired eyes, at last asked aloud how a bailiff was supposed to stop a prisoner from counting turnips, since no law he had ever heard of forbade a man from speaking numbers. The other guard, younger, said perhaps they ought to ask so directly whether counting counted as a crime, and the broad-faced one said he would rather not be the one to ask that particular question today. Pike pushed through the crowd sometime before noon, took one look at the board hung over my shoulders, and read the false charge on it aloud to anyone nearby who had not already heard it for themselves. He said a man who had held a county gate shut half a day with one stubborn ox was not about to be quiet about a false accusation painted on wood, and stayed near the stocks the rest of the afternoon, arms crossed, saying nothing further, but leaving all the same. Pike said nothing else. He planted himself beside the stocks, broad enough to make anyone planning trouble reconsider, and the crowd settled around him. Nayla came at mid-afternoon and begged me, quietly, to stop before Sold found some new law to invent on the spot, and I told her the moment I stopped was the moment this became only a punishment and nothing else. She did not argue further, only stayed near the stocks the rest of the day, refilling a cup of water at my mouth whenever my voice grew too dry to carry, since my hands could do nothing for myself. She asked, low enough that only I could hear it, whether I had planned any of this before Sold locked the boards over my shoulders, and I told her flatly that I had planned nothing beyond refusing to be silent. She said that was, in its own way, more frightening than a plan would have been, since a plan could fail and be set aside, and stubbornness like mine apparently could not. By late afternoon, the square had begun keeping its own running total. Several older men arguing over sums on their fingers, checking each other's arithmetic as children check a game for cheating. Someone worked out that the guild's toll, added across every cart, every sack, every barrel that had passed the square since dawn, came to more coin in a single day than most households in the district saw in a season. Bettany said the number aloud herself. Once it was settled between 3 separate counters, who all arrived at roughly the same figure, and the square went quiet as it had gone quiet at Vero's stall weeks before. Sold's men, still standing guard, had by then accepted bread from Bettany twice over the course of the afternoon, and I noticed the broad-faced one no longer quite meeting my eyes when the tally grew. Sometime past the hour when most stalls would ordinarily close, something small and grain-colored slipped along the base of the square wall, and climbed unnoticed at first onto the stocks beside my bent shoulder. Vesa announced to the 2 guards nearest me that the taller one carried at least 2 stone more weight than his own boots were built to bear comfortably, and that his knees would thank him for losing it. The guard went red to his ears, and the crowd nearest the stocks laughed harder at that single remark than at anything else said in the square all day, myself included. She continued down the row of onlookers, commenting on the true weight of a merchant's purse against what he claimed it held, until Nayla scooped her up and told her, not unkindly, that even a god needed to know when enough was enough. As the light began to fail, Sold himself returned to the square, apparently drawn by the size of the crowd rather than any concern for my welfare, and found the tally still being argued over by half the district. He asked what exactly a crowd this size thought it was accomplishing, and an old man near the front answered him plainly that they were simply counting what the guild had already taken, nothing more and nothing less. Sold looked at the board still hanging crooked over my shoulders, at the crowd, at his own men standing closer to Bettany's bread than to their posts, and something in his face shifted toward a calculation I could not read. He ordered the stocks open before full dark, a full hour earlier than the punishment he had announced, and said nothing about why as his men worked the lock free from my wrists and neck. I stood slowly, my legs stiff from the angle I had held all day, and asked him directly whether the gate would open now that the district had proven, out loud, what it was being asked to pay for. He did not answer that question with words. He only nodded once toward the gate, and within the hour, I heard the chain come free, and the first backed-up cart roll through into the square. Someone tore the board from where it had fallen and broke it over one knee, and the pieces went into Bettany's own oven fire. Before the night was through, the fastest cooking fire I ever saw lit out of pure spite. 2 of Sold's men did not report for duty the next morning, and word came back through Anders' little network that both had quietly told their captain they wanted no further part of guarding a man for counting turnips. I asked Nayla, once the square had at last emptied, whether a day spent locked in wood had been worth what it bought, and she said she would answer honestly once she had stopped being frightened long enough to think clearly. Bettany found me that evening. She said the day's public tally had turned more of the district against the guild's toll than a month of proving crooked scales one by one. My wrists still carried the grooves from the stocks. By sunset, stallholders had copied the day's total onto scraps and nailed them beside their prices, so no one could pretend tomorrow that the crowd had imagined the cost. Word reached us 2 days later, carried by a trader who had passed through the provincial capital on other business, that Ostrin Vale had placed an order there for a full new set of scales, built to his own exact specification by a master craftsman. Nayla asked what a weighmaster needed with new scales, when his old ones had never once been proven dishonest by anyone, myself included, and I said that was unfortunately the kind of question I did not yet have an answer for. Bettany said a man did not order a master craftsman's work all the way from the capital, unless he intended to be seen using it by everyone who had ever doubted him, and that Vale rarely spent coin without an audience in mind. Ike said, half joking, that new scales built by a master's hand would at least be honest ones, since a man that proud of his own name would not risk his reputation on a second hollow stone or a crooked beam. I said I hoped he was right, because an honest opponent with a flawless scale would be harder to beat than every crooked one I had faced so far, and I had a feeling, standing there with my wrists still aching, that we were about to find out how much harder. Vale sent word through the row himself, an actual invitation carried stall to stall, that he would unveil his new scales at midday in the square, where I had sat locked in wood 2 days before. The whole district turned out for it, more people than I had seen gathered even for the stocks, and I understood before a single scale was uncovered that Vale had chosen his stage well. 2 of his men wheeled a covered frame into the center of the square on a cart built specially for the purpose, and Vale himself pulled the cloth free with the flourish of a man who already knew what the crowd would see. The scale beneath was beautiful, brass and dark wood. Arms so precisely matched they seemed to have been cut from a single block and split down an invisible line. He told me he had ordered it from the finest instrument maker in the capital, spared no expense, and invited anyone in the district, myself included, to test it however they pleased. A murmur ran through the crowd at that, half daring me forward, half holding its breath, to see whether the branded stranger's luck had at last reached the end of its rope. Perrin Doak, near the front, said aloud that he had never once seen Vale invite scrutiny of his own work before, and that the invitation alone was worth watching closely. Check the arms first, the oldest trick I owned, hanging identical weights from each hook and watching the beam settle dead level without the slightest lean in either direction. I swapped the pans as I had at Vero's stall weeks before. Sack for counterweight for sack, and the reading did not shift by so much as a hair. I asked to test a coin against water, and Vale himself fetched the jug, and the 2 coins I tried displaced what their true silver content should have displaced. No debasement anywhere to find. I tried the char and reweigh trick next on a scrap of leather someone in the crowd offered, ringing and burning it as I had at the county gate, and the honest scrap and the scale agreed to the last grain. I stacked 5 of his own stamped weights in pairs, hunting for the one hollow stone I had learned to expect from every gate and stall in the district, and found every single one of them true, cast solid through. Vale watched me work through every method I owned, patient, almost courteous, and when I straightened up empty-handed, he asked, not unkindly, whether I had found anything at all to fault. I told him flatly that I had not, and the crowd's murmur told me they had expected that answer, though hearing it from my own mouth still cost something to say aloud. He proposed a direct comparison then, my beam against his scale, the same object weighed on both, to see whose instrument read the finer measure to the last grain. We weighed a single silver coin first, and his scale resolved a difference finer than my own beam could distinguish. A hair's weight my rope and ash could not separate from nothing at all. We weighed a measured length of Trice's own rope next, and again his scale caught a variance my beam simply lacked the precision to register, though the variance itself proved nothing dishonest, only finer. I had lost, cleanly, twice, not to a trick or a hollow stone or a swapped sample, but to a better instrument in the hands of a genuinely skilled man, and the crowd understood the difference, even if it stung the same. Vale did not gloat. He only said, quietly enough that it somehow carried further than shouting would have, that honest craft had always been available to anyone willing to pay what it actually cost. Vesa, riding in Nayla's basket at the edge of the crowd, chose that exact moment to announce, unprompted, that the scale before us was without question the finest piece of honest work she had encountered in 200 years. I hissed at her to be quiet, and she said she could not help it. The craftsmanship was simply that good, and repeated the compliment a second time, louder, directly in Vale's own hearing. Vale turned toward the small creature in the basket with an expression somewhere between confusion and genuine pleasure, and asked Nayla what her pet meant by 200 years. Nayla said quickly that it was simply a saying where she came from, and hurried the basket back through the crowd before Vesa could clarify the remark any further. Vesa was not so easily hurried. She raised her voice from inside the basket and added that the beam's balance alone showed a patience most craftsmen lost after their first apprenticeship. Vale actually laughed at that, a short surprise sound I had not heard from him before, and said he would take a compliment from wherever it came. Even a basket that talked. The crowd laughed with him. For one strange moment, the square ceased to feel like a battlefield. We were a market admiring fine work, even if the craftsman had built it to defeat me. Under my breath later, Vesa admitted she had tried 3 times to stop the compliments from leaving her mouth and had failed every time, and that being unable to lie was, on days like this one, a genuine curse rather than a virtue. I asked her, once we had some distance from the square, whether her power could do anything at all to help me match a craftsman's precision, and she went quiet in a way I had learned to read as caution. She said she could, if I asked it plainly, simply tell me the true reading of any object without a scale at all, and let me announce the number as though my own beam had found it. I asked what that would actually be, stripped of the kindness in the offer, and she said, honestly, because she could say nothing else, that it would be the kind of lie she existed to correct in other people. I told her no, and she looked almost relieved to hear it, as though she had been hoping I would refuse before she had to explain further why the offer had been a bad one to make. I asked her why she had offered it at all, then, if refusing it so outright pleased her, and she said a God who never offered the easy wrong path could not be trusted to mean it when she praised the harder right one. She said every dawn she had left in her belonged to correcting a wrong measure, not to handing a man victories his own hands had not earned, and that the distinction mattered more to her than winning ever could. I told her I understood the distinction well enough already, standing there with a lost contract and 3 households gone back to the guild, and she said, understanding it while it cost something was the only kind of understanding worth having. By early afternoon, a merchant who oversaw the district's larger grain contracts announced in the square that he would move his business to Vale's newly proven scales rather than risk another season on an unlicensed beam. 3 more households, who had quietly stopped paying the guild toll after the stocks announced, before the crowd dispersed, that they intended to start paying again, satisfied that Vale's craft had earned back their trust. One of them, an old carter I recognized from the Stocks Day crowd, would not meet my eyes as he said it, and I understood that shame, not conviction, was doing most of the talking for him. And he found me afterward and said losing 3 households and 1 merchant's contract in a single afternoon was a hard blow, but not, in her opinion, a fatal one, provided I did not let the loss curdle into giving up entirely. Pike said much the same, gruffer about it, and reminded me that an honest scale in Vale's hands still weighed honest, and an honest loss on fair ground was not the same wound as every crooked trick we had already beaten. Tally, who had heard the news from his own stall by then, sent a boy over with a fresh cut of fish and a message that a man did not stop trusting his fishmonger over one bad afternoon, and he did not intend to stop trusting me either. Bryce said she had lost 40 marks to an outright swindle and survived it, and that losing a single contract to a craftsman who had simply outcrafted me was, by comparison, an almost dignified way to lose. I told them all I appreciated the kindness and meant it, but a loss dressed up kindly by friends still weighed exactly the same as the loss itself once the friends had gone home for the night. After the crowd dispersed, I tested my beam with the same coin until dusk. It gave the same honest reading every time and still missed the hair's weight Vale's instrument caught. The limit belonged to my tool. Anger could not repair it, and pride could not argue it away. I walked back to the shrine that evening, lower than I had felt since the day they cut my ear, and Nayla did not try to talk me out of the feeling, only sat with me until it had run its course on its own. As the light went fully down, an old man I did not recognize appeared at the shrine's broken wall, moving carefully, one hand out ahead of him, like a man moves when his eyes have mostly failed him. Introduced himself as Corin Sill, keeper of the district mill, and said he had watched the square from a distance that afternoon. close enough to see the shape of things even if his eyes could no longer read the fine details. He said he had something in his mill that the day's defeat had convinced him it was time to bring into the light, and asked whether I would come to him after dark, quietly, without announcing it to the Rao first. I asked why quietly, and he said some things, once spoken where the wrong ears could hear them, could not be unspoken again, and he intended this particular thing to reach the ears he chose and no others. I agreed to come, because a day that had cost me a merchant's contract and 3 households had also apparently cost me nothing at all with a half-blind miller I had never met before that evening. He nodded once, satisfied, and turned back toward the mill road at the same careful pace he had arrived by, leaving me to wonder, the rest of that long night, what an old man kept hidden that he judged worth this much caution to reveal. Ayla asked whether I trusted a stranger who refused to say his business in the open, and I told her that after a day spent losing to an honest man, a little mystery from a careful one felt almost like a kindness. Vesa, curled against my side on the altar stone, said the old man had smelled of oil and grain dust and something else underneath. Old paper kept dry for a very long time, and that dry old paper rarely stayed hidden without a reason worth hearing. I did not sleep well that night, turning the day's defeat over one side and then the other, and wondering whether a half-blind miller's secret would prove worth more than the contract and the households I had lost to earn the chance to hear it. Corin Sill's mill stood dark except for a single lamp, and he opened the door before I had finished knocking, as though his ears had done the work his eyes no longer could. He led me inside without much talk, past sacks of flour stacked by feel rather than by sight, to a back room where a wooden chest sat waiting on a table already cleared for it. He lifted the lid himself, slow and careful, and inside lay a book thick as 2 fists together, its pages soft with handling and dark along the edges from 30 years of oil lamp smoke. He said the book held every true weight he had ever milled against, going back to the harvest his own father died, and that he had kept it hidden all along out of a caution he had never fully explained even to himself. I asked why a miller would keep such a record at all, and he said a man who weighs grain for a living learns early which numbers the guild's own certified scales actually produce, and which numbers the grain itself produces. He said the 2 numbers had disagreed, quietly, for 30 years, in a pattern too steady to be accident, and that he had written down every disagreement rather than say a word about it aloud. I turned pages by lamplight and saw entries running back further than my own life, dates marked by which harvest had been good or thin, wet or early, a calendar only Coran himself could truly read. He said the book alone would convince no one, since numbers on a page could always be argued as a miller's error, and that what the district needed was proof the guild's own stamps themselves were false. He said there was one person left in the county who could look at an impression pressed in wax or lead and tell, from the shape of a single slipped line, whether the die that made it was the registered one or not. Her name, he said, was Adiva Kaur, and she had once cut every legal stamp the guild used, 12 years at it, until she refused to cut a second die for Vale and found herself thrown out for the refusal. I asked where to find her, and Corin said she kept a small forge at the edge of the district now, taking whatever metalwork the row would still pay a disgraced woman to do, and that she trusted almost no one who came asking about stamps. I found her the next evening where Corin had said, hunched over a cold forge with a set of fine tools laid out before her, like a surgeon's instruments rather than a smith's. She did not look up when I introduced myself, only asked, flatly, whether I had come to hire her honest work, or to ask her to relive the reason she no longer had any honest work worth hiring. I told her about Corin's book, about 30 years of disagreement between what the guild certified and what the grain itself proved, and asked whether she would look at the impressions his book referenced. She was quiet long enough that I thought she might refuse outright. And then she said the last time she picked up her burns for anyone but herself, it had cost her the only trade she had ever loved. She told me she had spent 12 years cutting stamps so clean that a buyer could trust a scale on site alone, and that losing the right to do that work had felt less like losing a trade and more like losing a hand she still reached for out of habit. I asked what had happened, and she said Vale had asked her to cut a second die, quietly, for scales he wanted certified without the usual inspection, and that refusing him had been the easiest decision and the costliest one of her life. I told her I could not promise it would cost her nothing this time either, only that a district tired of being cheated deserved better than her silence, whatever silence had cost her to keep. She studied me a long moment, as I imagine she once studied a coin for a counterfeit maker's tell, and at last said she would look once and decide afterward whether looking twice was worth the risk. We returned to Karan's mill together that same night, and she went through his book page by page, running one fingertip over the wax impressions he had pressed beside certain entries across the years. She stopped often, held a page close to the lamp, and muttered about a crooked curve or shallow serif with the offended precision of a master inspecting careless apprentice work. She said at one page that whoever had cut this particular die clearly rushed the crossbar, and that any apprentice of hers would have been sent back to the bench for carelessness this obvious. I asked how she could read so much from a mark smaller than a fingernail, and she said 12 years of cutting the same lines taught a hand to recognize another hand's mistakes, like a mother recognizes her own child's handwriting. Corin asked dryly whether she meant to grade the forger's work like a master judging a failed exam, and she said someone ought to, since the man responsible for it had never once been held to any standard at all. At another page, she declared the depth of the cut uneven, front to back, the mark of a man rushing to finish before someone walked in on him, and said even a frightened apprentice usually managed steadier hands than that. Corin, without missing a beat, dated that particular page by the year of the flood that took out the mill race, and Adiva asked how a man who could not see the page still managed to know which harvest it belonged to. He said his fingers remembered the paper's damage from the flood better than his eyes had ever managed the ink, and went back to counting without further explanation, as though the answer were obvious to anyone who had lived it. By the second hour, she had sorted the impressions into two clear piles, one bearing the registered die's clean, confident lines, the other bearing a second hand entirely, hesitant in exactly the same place every single time. She said the second die's carver always slipped at the same corner of the crossbar, a habit no forger could correct without cutting an entirely new die, which meant every false stamp in the pile came from one man's hand, used again and again for years. Corin counted the two piles himself, slow and careful with his fingers since his eyes could no longer manage it, and announced that of the 87 impressions in his book, 39 carried the false die's telltale slip. Nearly half, across 30 years, certified as legal by a die that had never been registered with anyone but the man who cut it, likely in exchange for whatever quiet toll Vale collected from those willing to pay for a friendlier number. Adiva said the hand behind the second die was Vale's own, self-taught these past years since he threw her out rather than let anyone else near it, and that she intended to be certain of the match before she said so publicly. Corin closed the book carefully once she had finished, and sat a moment with both hands flat on its cover, as a man sits with something he has carried too long and is not yet ready to let go of entirely. He said handing over the book meant everyone in the district would learn what he had known and concealed for 30 years. His silence, he added, had never been free. I told him no one would blame a miller for staying quiet under a monopoly that could ruin him for speaking, and he said that was kind of me. But kindness was not what he had come to ask for that night. He asked me directly to look after his daughter, Mira, once this book left his hands and the guild understood who had kept it, since a man his age with failing eyes could protect her from very little on his own. I answered that I would take that as a promise, not a favor, and he nodded once, satisfied, and said a promise from a branded stranger was, in his considerable experience, worth more than most sworn oaths from men with clean ears. He said Mira ran the mill for him most days already, since his eyes had failed faster than either of them expected, and that she deserved a life that did not end with her paying, in whatever coin the guild preferred, for her father's 30 years of silence. I asked what he thought that coin might be, and he said he could not say yet, only that anyone who had watched Vale ruin smaller debts than this one had learned not to guess at the shape of the bill before it arrived. Adiva agreed to return with me the next day, carrying the impressions themselves, though she said flatly that picking her burns back up after her exile felt less like courage and more like walking back into a fire she had barely escaped once already. Before we left the mill, Adiva marked 5 false impressions with a pinprick only she could place. If Vale tried to switch a page or a die at the gate, those tiny marks would expose the substitution before the crowd. I asked what would happen to her if the guild learned she had helped prove the second die, and she said exile a second time, at best, and worse than exile if Vale decided an example needed making of her specifically. She said she was doing it anyway, because 39 false stamps sitting quietly in a mill for 30 years had cost this district more than her own comfort was worth protecting. We left the mill before dawn, the book wrapped in oilcloth under my arm, and walked back toward the row together in a silence that felt less like caution now, and more like 3 people who had just agreed to the same dangerous thing. Word reached us before we had even crossed back into the market row that Vale himself had stood at the gates that very morning and announced, to whoever cared to listen, the exact date of the district's formal stamping day. He had called for every scale and every weight in Vetch Hollow to be brought forward for certification against his own new standard, and invited, by name, anyone who still doubted his craft to bring their doubts along with them. Onder caught up with us at the Rose Edge, breathless as always, and reported that Vale had named the gates themselves as the site, wanting the entire district watching when the last doubters were proven wrong. He asked what Corrin's book contained that had me smiling, which nothing had managed since the loss in the square. He would hear it with everyone else at the stamping day, no earlier. Onder looked wounded at being kept from a secret, but recovered quickly enough to start planning, aloud, how many boys he would need posted around the gates to watch every face in the crowd when the truth finally landed. Nayla asked whether Vale had any idea what we now carried wrapped in oilcloth, and I told her that judging by the confidence in his voice when the news reached us, he had no idea at all, and that suited me perfectly well. Adava, walking a step behind us with the impressions bundled carefully against her chest, said only that confidence was the one thing a forger's victim could always count on, right up until the moment it broke. The market gates had never held so many people at once. Every stall closed for the day. Every household in Vetch Hollow crowded shoulder to shoulder to watch Vale certify the district's scales. His new beam stood mounted on a raised platform built specially for the occasion, brass catching the morning light, and Vale himself moved through the line of waiting scale owners with the easy confidence of a man who had already won. Onder's 3 boys had spread themselves through the crowd as he had promised, one near the platform, one at the gate itself, one drifting the edges, and each gave me a small private signal to say the crowd was watching and ready. Ayla stood close beside me, her hand tight around my arm, and asked one more time whether I was entirely certain about what we were about to do in front of every soul in the district at once. I told her certainty had never once been part of the offer, only the evidence, and that Corrin and Adiva had both risked more than I had to bring it this far. I stood near the front with Corrin on one arm and Adiva close behind me, the book wrapped in oilcloth against my chest, and we let the first dozen scales pass certification honestly, as they should have. Cass Vero stepped up near the middle of the line, and I watched him press something small and quiet into Vale's palm, before offering his own scale for testing, a gesture too practiced to be anything but old habit. Vale's hand did not go to the registered die hanging openly from his belt. It went instead to a smaller pouch at his hip, and drew out a second stamp entirely, dark metal, worn smooth at the grip from years of hidden use. I called out, loud enough to carry across the entire gathered crowd, and asked Vale flatly which die he intended to press into Vero's scale, since 2 very different tools had just come out of 2 very different places on his belt. The square fell silent. Vale's hand stopped in midair, the second die trapped between his fingers where everyone could see it. He said, too quickly, that every weighmaster carried a spare tool for emergencies, and I told him a spare tool did not usually need hiding in a separate pouch, out of sight, reached for only when a coin had just changed hands. Vero, still standing at the platform waiting for his own scale to be tested, went pale and took one step back from the die still caught in Vale's fingers, as though putting distance between himself and it might undo what he had just been seen doing. Vale told him sharply to stay where he was, that nothing had been proven yet, and Vero said weakly that he had only ever done what every other stall owner in the row had quietly done for years, which was hardly the defense he seemed to think it was. Out of us stepped forward then, and asked to see the die itself, and Vale's grip tightened around it for a moment, before he seemed to realize that refusing in front of this crowd would answer the question louder than showing it ever could. She took it from his open palm, turned it once under the light, and said, in a voice gone very quiet and very certain, that she recognized the crossbar's slip on sight, the same hand she had spent a full night confirming in Corrin's book. I unwrapped the oilcloth and held the book up so the nearest rows of the crowd could see its thickness, and told them it held 30 years of true weights recorded against what the guild had certified in the same years. Corrin spoke up at last, his voice carrying further than I expected from a man his age, and said he had kept the record himself, quietly, because a miller learns early which numbers the grain produces and which numbers a guild produces. Adava held the second die beside the book's most recent impressions, turning both slowly for the row nearest us to compare with their own eyes, and said the telltale slip matched on every single page she had checked. I proposed then that we settle the matter as this whole district had learned to settle matters, not by argument, but by measure, on the very scale Vale had built his reputation on proving. I asked Vale's own assistant to bring the registered die from the guild's box and set both dies, false and true, on Vale's flawless new beam, side by side, as I had once set 2 scraps of hide at the county gate. The beam did not sit level. The false die, cast from cheaper metal to save cost on a tool meant never to be examined closely, weighed measurably lighter than the registered one. A difference Vale's own precision instrument rendered impossible to argue away. The very fineness Vale had used to beat me in the square 2 weeks before now betrayed him completely, because a scale that honest could not be persuaded to lie for its owner, any more than it had been persuaded to lie for me. The crowd's murmur turned into something louder, dozens of voices working out aloud what 30 years and 39 false stamps actually meant for every scale in the district that had ever carried Vale's second mark. Vero, still standing at the platform with his own scale between us, said loudly that he had paid for a friendly number more times than he cared to admit, and that he had assumed, wrongly, that every stall owner in the row did the same. Merrick Sold pushed through the crowd toward the platform, and for one long breath, I did not know whether he had come to defend Vale or to arrest him, and judging by his own face, he did not entirely know either. He looked at the 2 dies still sitting unequal on the beam, at Adiva's steady expression, at the book still open in Karan's hands, and made his decision, as I had watched him make every decision since the stocks, for himself first. He asked me directly, low enough that only those of us nearest the platform could hear, whether I had told anyone yet that his own men had once taken bread from Bettany while guarding my stocks and listened to the tally without reporting it. I assured him I had told no one, and had no reason to start now, since a bailiff who opened a gate and shortened a punishment when the crowd's mood shifted had already shown me which way he preferred to bend when it mattered. He held my eyes a moment longer, weighing the offer. Then he squared his shoulders toward the crowd, ready to present self-preservation as public duty. He announced loudly enough for the whole district to hear that he was placing Austrian Vale under arrest for 30 years of certified fraud against the Crown's weighing law, and that his office had suspected nothing until that morning. Vale protested that Sowold had taken guild coin from him same as anyone. Sowold cut him off and said whatever coin had changed hands between them was a matter for another day. Today concerned 39 false stamps and nothing else. Disbelief crossed Vale's face first. Then he searched for someone else to blame. When none appeared, he fell silent, every argument spent. He said quietly that the guild had set the standards, not him, as though the excuse might still work here, as it had worked for Vero weeks before, and this time the crowd did not accept it from him any more than they had from Vero. I told him plainly that a guild could set a standard, but only one man's hand had cut a second die, and only one man's belt had carried it hidden for 30 years, and no standard anywhere excused that choice from being entirely his own. He looked past me toward the crowd, searching for some face that might still take his side. He found rows of people who had paid his quiet second toll and hated themselves a little for it. An old woman near the front said she had paid Vale's private toll twice, out of fear rather than dishonesty. Hearing it named aloud, she said, finally lifted a shame she had carried alone for years. Someone near the back of the crowd shouted for Vale to be put in the stocks himself, and the shout picked up quickly, voices layering over each other with the particular hunger of a crowd remembering how it had felt to watch me sit there. Nayla pushed forward before the shout could grow further and said, loud enough to cut through it, that a district proving itself honest did not need to prove it by becoming a mob, and that Vale's stamp gone was punishment enough for today. I found I agreed with her more than I expected to, standing there with 30 years of his fraud laid open in front of everyone, and I added my own voice to hers, asking the crowd to let Sold's arrest stand as the day's full answer. Shouting dropped to something short of silence, enough for Sold to take as his cue to have his own men strip the registered die and the guild's certification seal from Vale's belt then and there, in front of every corner of the district. He announced that Vale's license to weigh anything in this county was revoked from that moment forward, and that any scale certified under his mark in the past 30 years would need to be reweighed and reissued by whoever the guild sent to replace him. I stepped up onto the platform myself then, and asked Sold directly for the one thing I had come to this district owed from the very first morning, my father's counting rod, still locked wherever the old toll box had ended up. Sold sent a man to fetch it, and when the box was finally forced open, my father's rod came out as it had gone in, brass shod and true ash, notched down every span by his own hand, untouched by 2 months of confiscation. I held it a long moment before I trusted my own voice again, and Pike, standing near enough to see, said only that some debts took longer to collect than others, but a debt collected in full was still worth the wait. Bettany asked what would happen to the market gates, with no licensed weighmaster to certify anything. Sowood paused, then said the district would have to measure for itself in the meantime. Ragged cheer rose, gathered strength, and rolled through the gates, For the first time in living memory, no guild stamp stood above the district's own honest hands. Onder appeared at my side, grinning wider than I had ever seen, and announced that his 3 boys had started taking bets on how long the district would argue over who measured what without a guild to blame. I told him a district arguing over honest numbers instead of paying quiet tolls in fear was, on balance, a considerable improvement, and he agreed, though he added that he intended to charge a small fee for settling the loudest of those arguments himself. Tally pushed through to shake my hand, said he had closed his stall for the day just to watch, and that watching Vale's own scale betray him had been worth more to him than a full week of fish sold at the going rate. Price said, the first mark of clean profit at the county gate had felt like a beginning, and this felt like something else entirely, though she could not yet find the right word for what that something else was. Corin stood quietly through the celebration, his book once again wrapped in oilcloth under his arm, and said to me alone that 30 years of silence had finally cost him nothing worse than the fear of speaking, which felt to him like a fair trade at last. Adava did not join the cheering either. She stayed at the platform's edge, turning the false die over in her fingers one last time, and said she intended to petition for her own name to be cleared, now that the man who exiled her stood exiled himself. I told her I would stand beside her for that petition however she needed, and she said, in a tone I had never once heard from her, something that sounded almost like hope rather than caution. By late afternoon, the crowd had mostly dispersed back to stalls that had stood closed all day, carts finally moving, the ordinary noise of the row slowly returning to a square that had held its breath since morning. As the last of the district drifted away from the gates, I noticed a man in guild gray, standing perfectly still near the road out, not moving to help clear the platform, not speaking to Sold's men, only watching the emptying square with patient, unreadable attention. He did not approach us, and when I finally looked back toward him a second time, he had not moved an inch, still waiting, as though the day's events were only the beginning of whatever report he had come to Vetch Hollow to carry home. Nayla noticed him too, and asked whether he might be connected to the rider who had passed through without stopping weeks before, on the same road, in the same unhurried, deliberate manner. I told her I could not say, only that a district which had just broken one Waymaster's 30-year grip had likely not yet reached the end of what the wider guild was willing to spend, keeping a hold on a crossroads this valuable. Pike, hearing that, said plainly that an ox that had held one gate shut for half a day could learn to hold a second one just as well, whenever the district needed it to, and I found more comfort in that promise than in anything else said that whole long day. The silent man from the gates found me 3 days later at Bettany's stall rather than at the shrine, and introduced himself with a calm that felt more unsettling than any shout Vale had ever managed. He gave his name as Cyril Hask, provincial guildmaster, and said he had come to see for himself what kind of man had managed to unseat a district waymaster without ever raising his voice. I asked whether he had come to arrest me too, and he said no, quite the opposite, that he had come with an offer worth considerably more than anything the district could pay me in bread and shares. He said the guild had a place for a man with my particular talent for finding what other men hid, a real position, real coin, and a stamp of my own that no bailiff or crowd could ever strip from me. I asked what such a position would cost, since nothing in my experience with the guild had ever come free, and he said only one small favor, banked for later, a single false stamp when the guild eventually needed one. He said it so plainly, so without shame, that for a moment I almost mistook the offer for an honest one, before I understood what he was asking me to become, in exchange for never being poor again. I asked him whether he had made this same offer to Vale once, years ago, before Vale ever cut his first illegal die, and Hask said he made the same offer to every talented man in every district he oversaw, and that most of them eventually said yes. I asked what happened to the ones who did not, and he said very little, usually, which was itself the most unsettling answer he could have given me, since a threat spoken plainly would have told me less than that quiet shrug did. I told him no, and he did not argue, did not raise his voice, only nodded once as though I had merely confirmed something he had already suspected about me before he ever made the offer. He said most men refused the first time out of pride, and accepted the second time once they understood what refusal actually cost, and turned to leave the stall without waiting for my answer to that either. I called after him and asked how long I had before he expected a different answer, and he said, without turning back, that he was a patient man, and that patience had never once cost him a district yet. Bettany asked once he had gone, whether a man that calm was more or less dangerous than a man who shouted, and I told her I did not yet know, only that I intended to find out sooner than either of us would like. We did not have to wait long. Within 2 days, word reached Trice that every hemp merchant in the province had suddenly stopped selling to her, their stock all bought up at once by a single buyer, paying well above the going rate. She came to the shrine that evening with her hands empty, which I had never once seen from her, no rope coiled over her shoulders, nothing left in her stores to spin. She said Hask himself had not so much as spoken to her directly, only sent an agent to buy every scrap of raw fiber in 3 counties before she even heard the price had moved. I asked what she intended to do without material, and she said flatly that a rope maker without rope was simply a woman with empty hands and a debt still owed, no different from the day Skell's swindle first cost her 40 marks. Diva had been quiet through most of that conversation, standing near the shrine wall with her arms crossed, and when Trice finished speaking she said the district still had no license stamp at all since Vale's fall, and that this could not go on much longer either. She said she intended to cut a new die herself, quietly, without the guild's authorization, since the guild that would have authorized her no longer had any honest claim to that authority in this district. I told her plainly that cutting an unlicensed die was still a crime under guild law, regardless of how honest the work behind it was, and that I had watched a man lose his hand for less than what she was proposing to do. She said she had already lost her trade once for refusing to cut a dishonest die, and that losing something further for cutting an honest one felt, to her, like a fair trade she was willing to make on her own terms. I argued with her longer than either of us expected, told her the district needed her whole, and working far more than it needed one more martyr to a law neither of us had written, and she heard every word of it and did it anyway. She asked me, in the middle of the argument, whether I intended to let 6 households go on trading without any legal mark at all, simply because the only person who could cut one was afraid of what it might cost her. I told her fear was not the word I would have chosen, only caution earned the hard way. And she said caution had already cost her 12 years once, and she was not willing to let it cost the district a second time on her account. I asked what I was supposed to tell Corin, or Nayla, or any of the people who had come to rely on her, if the guild took the rest of her hand instead of only 2 fingers. She said I could tell them exactly what had happened, with her own name attached, and let them judge whether it had been worth it. She worked through 2 full nights at her forge, cutting a new die clean and true, and pressed the district's first honest, unlicensed stamp into 6 scales before anyone outside our small circle knew the work existed. A guild inspector, passing through on unrelated business, found one of those 6 scales and recognized the cut for what it was within a single look. No confusion, no doubt, only the flat certainty of a trained eye. They took her before I even heard the inspector had arrived, and by the time Nayla ran to fetch me, the guild's own law had already been carried out in the square, swift and unappealable. Nayla said the inspector had not even raised his voice through the whole procedure, reading the punishment off a card like a clerk reads a familiar form, as though 2 fingers were simply a line item in a ledger he had filled out 100 times before. I ran the last stretch to the square anyway, too late to change anything, and found only a small crowd already dispersing and a smear of blood on the platform where the stocks had once stood 2 months before. She lost 2 fingers from her right hand, the same hand that had cut every legal stamp in the district for 12 years before her exile, and the same hand that had cut 6 honest ones in secret rather than watch the district go without. I found her afterward, with the wound bound tight in clean cloth, sitting very still, and asked why she had not simply let me argue her out of it before the inspector ever arrived to make the choice permanent. She said an argument, however good, had never once cut a working stamp, and that 6 scales in the district now carried an honest mark regardless of what it had cost her hand to put there. Onder arrived not long after with news of his own, and named a price for it that would have embarrassed even a guild factor, explaining, with a perfectly straight face, that information about provincial guildmasters carried provincial rates. I asked whether meals still counted the same as coin, as they always had, and he said not for news this size, and produced a small ledger of his own where he had apparently begun tracking what each piece of information was worth against the last. I paid him anyway, because the news itself turned out to matter more than the principle of arguing him down, and he told me plainly that Hask had just purchased the toll gate on the caravan road outright from whoever had held its lease before. Nayla asked what that meant for the venture, and I told her it meant the same road we had once walked freely to reach Fenaduva's caravan now belonged, gate and toll both, to the one man in the province who had already tried to buy me once and failed. She asked whether that made the road more dangerous or simply more expensive, and I said with Cyril Hask, I had a growing suspicion the 2 things had never actually been separate at all. Bettany, still without rope enough to properly bind her own ovens shut for the night, said she had survived worse buyers than Cyril Hask, though she admitted quietly that she had never before faced one who never once raised his voice to do it. Tally sent word through one of Anders' boys that his own supplier had also been approached about selling exclusively to a new provincial buyer and that he had refused, mostly out of loyalty to the district and partly, he admitted, out of pure stubbornness. I asked Ander whether Hask had approached any of his own boys directly, and he said not yet, though he had already begun training 2 of them to recognize a bribe on sight, since a smart operation prepared for trouble before trouble arrived rather than after. Pike came by the shrine as the light went down and said he had heard about Adava's hand and about the toll gate both in the same afternoon, and asked flatly whether the district intended to keep fighting a man who apparently never made a single mistake. Told him it was too early to say, only that a man who bought his victories instead of shouting for them still had to spend real coin to do it, and that every coin he spent on us was a coin he could not spend elsewhere. Trice, sitting with her empty hands still folded in her lap, said that was a colder kind of comfort than she had hoped for, though she admitted after a moment that it was not nothing either. Adava flexed her bandaged hand once, testing what remained of it against the pain, and said 6 honest stamps in one district was still 6 more than the guild had allowed the whole province in 30 years, and that she did not regret the count. Before we left, I copied the names of all 6 owners whose scales carried Adiva's new mark. If Hask tried to isolate them one by one, the rest of us would know who had been threatened and whose scale needed guarding. I sat with all of them a long while that evening, counting what the day had actually cost against what it had actually bought, as I had once counted grain for an army that never once thanked me for getting the number right. The tally came out uneven, Trice's workshop empty, Adiva's hand short 2 fingers, and against all of it, only 6 scales, and a stubborn, growing certainty that Cyril Hask intended to spend whatever it took to prove the district could not stand without a guild to run it. Nayla asked, near the end of that long night, whether a man who never lost his temper could actually be beaten at all, or whether patience alone made him unbeatable regardless of what the district managed to prove against him. I told her every man had a number somewhere that cost more than he was willing to spend, and that our whole task now was finding out what Cyril Hask's number was before he found out ours first. Pike's cart reached Hask's new toll gate, loaded with the last of what the district could spare for trade, and the gate warden there did not so much as glance at our weight before naming a toll twice what any honest crossing should cost. I asked to see his counterweight stones, out of habit more than hope, and found every single one of them true, cast solid, no hollow, no lead shot hidden anywhere inside them. The toll was simply the toll, set high on purpose by a man who owned the gate outright and had no fraud left to hide, which meant none of my tricks had anything left to catch. I asked the warden whether the toll rate was written anywhere I could see it, and he produced a small posted notice, dated and signed properly, as legal as any toll had ever been in this district. I read it twice, looking for the crack a crooked measure always left somewhere, and found nothing, only a fair notice of an unfair price, which turned out to be a considerably harder thing to fight than a lie ever was. Pike swore under his breath and said a lawful robbery was somehow worse than a crooked one, since at least a crooked toll left a man something to fight honestly. I said I understood the feeling, and that Hask had clearly learned something from watching Vale fall, since a man who broke no rule at all left nothing behind for a crowd to gather around and count. I asked whether any other road reached Oduva's camp, and Pike said only one, a string of river fords further south that drovers used in dry seasons, faster even than the main road when the water ran low enough. He said the fords crossed private land the entire way though, land held by a widow named Ance Marrow, who had turned away every drover who asked to cross it for as long as he could remember. He found her at a modest house near the riverbank, a woman with sun-worn hands and eyes that measured us both before either of us had said a word. I asked plainly for passage across her fords, and she said the same thing she apparently told every drover who asked, that her land was hers and she owed the district nothing after what the district had already taken from her family. Pike tried offering coin for the passage, and she waved it off without even looking at it properly, said she had turned away drovers with heavier purses than his and would go on doing so, regardless of what any of them offered. I told her I was not there to offer coin at all, only to ask a question about what the district had taken, since in my experience a grudge that specific usually had a number attached to it somewhere. I asked what had been taken, and she said her father's holding had once run 4 acres further toward the river than it did now, land lost to a boundary survey decades past that no one had ever bothered explaining to her satisfaction. Pike said quietly, once we were out of her earshot, that he remembered hearing something about that survey years ago, a guild man walking the boundary with a chain that read short every single time it favored the neighboring landholder instead of Marrow's father. I asked whether the old boundary markers still stood, and Pike said as far as he knew they did, half sunk in mud at the river's edge, unmoved since the day they were first driven wrong into the ground. I went back to Marrow that evening and said a crooked measure had likely shortened her father's land. The same fraud I had spent months proving across the district. I knew someone who might fix it if Marrow stood at the markers at dawn. She looked at me like a woman looks at a stranger offering something too good to trust, and said she did not believe in gods, had not believed in one since the year the boundary moved, and no god had lifted a finger to stop it. I told her she did not need to believe in anything, only to stand at her own boundary markers at first light and watch what happened, and that if nothing happened, she would have lost nothing but one morning's sleep. She agreed, reluctantly, more out of curiosity than hope, and Nayla brought Vesa down to the riverbank in her basket while the sky was still fully dark. At the gray edge of dawn, Vesa hopped down onto the nearest sunken marker, sniffed the old stone, and announced that the chain which set this line had read a full length short on purpose, favoring the neighbor by exactly 4 acres. She touched the marker once, said the correction plainly, as she had once corrected Nayla's debt in a broken shrine 2 months before, and the old stone seemed, in the gray light, to settle very slightly deeper into ground that was once again unambiguously hers. Marrow said nothing for a long moment, walked the new line herself from marker to marker, 4 full acres reclaimed along the river's edge, and finally said flatly that the land felt exactly the same under her boots as it had a minute before. I asked whether that meant she still did not believe, and she said belief had nothing to do with it. The land was hers now regardless of what had put it back in her name, and a woman did not need faith to recognize her own boundary when she saw it. She opened her fords freely from that day. Vesa received no thanks. The 4 restored acres left Marrow enough ground to spare a path without missing it. Pike walked the fords first, with his lead ox testing the current. At the deepest point, the water rose past its knees, shallow enough to cross yet deep enough to make every driver hold their breath from bank to bank. Vesa refused outright to be carried across in the basket, declaring the water an insult to a god of any standing, and insisted instead on being carried on outstretched arms, held well above the current. Nayla carried her the first crossing, arms already aching by the halfway point, and Vesa complained the entire way that she was being held unevenly, tilted in a manner no dignified creature should have to tolerate. I carried her the second crossing myself, arms raised as level as I could manage, and she still found fault, insisting my left arm sagged a full inch lower than my right every step of the way across. By the third ford, she had reduced both of us to comparing notes on technique, and Pike, watching from atop his ox, said he had never in his life seen 2 grown adults argue so seriously about the correct way to hold a talking house cat over a river. Marrow, standing on her own bank watching the whole procession cross, allowed herself a single short laugh at that, the first sound of amusement I had heard from her since we arrived, quickly covered by a cough that fooled no one. Vesa, catching the laugh despite the cough, announced loudly from Nayla's arms that even a skeptic recognized proper carrying technique when she saw its absence demonstrated so thoroughly. Marrow did not answer that, only turned back toward her house, though I noticed she stayed at the riverbank a while longer than strictly necessary before she finally went inside. We reached Odova's camp by mid-afternoon, later than the main road would have taken, but whole, cargo dry, and Odova himself said the delay mattered less to him than the fact that we had reached him at all despite Hask's gate. He renewed the standing arrangement without argument this time, said a supplier resourceful enough to find a second road when the first one closed was worth more to him than one who simply paid whatever toll stood in the way. He asked, almost in passing, whether Hask himself had bought the gate purely to squeeze the district or for some larger reason connected to the province's grain trade generally, and I admitted I did not yet know which. Duva said men like Hask rarely spent that kind of coin on a single grudge, and that I would do well to find out the larger reason before it arrived at my own door, dressed as something else entirely. We returned by the same fords 2 days later, Marrow watching from her doorway without waving, though she did not turn us away either, which I had come to understand was, from her, close enough to a welcome. Word of the returned 4 acres had reached the district by the time we arrived home, carried faster than any cart by the simple fact that a woman who had refused every drover for years, had suddenly opened her land to anyone the venture sent. Bettany said Merrow's quiet cooperation carried more weight than any believer's praise. A skeptic had checked the boundary herself before opening the road. Warren, hearing the story secondhand from Onder, said 30 years of milling had taught him that a doubter who checked the boundary herself was worth 10 believers who never once walked the line. That evening, a folded letter arrived at the shrine, carried by a writer none of us recognized, sealed with a wax mark I had never seen before. Official in a way that made Nayla go very still the moment she saw it. It came from the Provincial Registry of Gods and stated in the flat, bloodless language of an office that had clearly written the same words 100 times before, that the shrine of Vesa, called the Even Hand, was scheduled for permanent removal from the register. Nayla read it twice, her hands shaking slightly by the second pass, and asked what permanent removal from a register actually meant for a shrine that had already been struck off once, years before either of us arrived here. I did not have an honest answer for her. Only the cold certainty that a letter this carefully worded was rarely the whole of what an office like that eventually intended to do about it. Vesa read the letter over Nayla's shoulder, sniffed at the seal, and said the wax alone smelled of a very old, very tired office that had struck far more names from its rolls than it had ever bothered to remember afterward. I asked whether she had seen such a letter in her 200 years. Vesa's answer was a long silence. She had more than once, and none had ended well for the god named on the page. Nayla folded the letter carefully and set it on the altar stone beside the empty bowl, and said she did not intend to let one more piece of paper decide what happened to the only home she had left. I told her paper alone had never yet decided anything in this district. Not the toll, not the stamp, not the stocks, and that whatever came after this letter would arrive with hands attached to it, same as everything else had. She did not look comforted by that. She nodded once, and I understood we had both just agreed, without saying so plainly, that a fight was coming that neither of us yet knew how to win. That night, Nayla brought out 7 years of lamp accounts and stacked them beside the registry letter. Poverty had forced precision on the shrine. Every refill had come from a household already counting bread, so she knew the oil down to the cup and the last copper spent on it. Second visitor arrived at the shrine the morning after the registry letter, though this one came on her own feet, unannounced, dressed in robes too fine and too clean for a district as threadbare as ours. She introduced herself as Ilsa Warren, keeper of the Temple of Full Granaries 2 villages east, and said she had heard with great interest about a shrine whose god had started handing out justice by the dawn. I asked what interest a well-fed temple 2 villages away had in a struck-off shrine like ours, and she said, warmly, that she had come to offer help rather than to gloat over another god's hardship. Her robes, up close, carried the faint smell of fresh bread and good oil, the smell of a household that had never once gone hungry, and I found myself trusting the smell more than I trusted her words. She said her own temple never wanted for grain, never turned away a hungry family, and that she had come to propose a simple arrangement, her granaries feeding Vetch Hollow, in exchange for a modest tithe and a shared festival calendar. Vesa, listening from the altar stone, asked her directly how a temple 2 villages away kept its granaries full every single season, without fail, since even an honest harvest failed sometimes. Ilsa said her worshippers gave gladly, out of gratitude rather than obligation, and that gratitude given freely tended to fill a granary faster than any tithe collected by force ever could. I asked whether her offer meant our own households would need to choose between 2 gods, and she said not choose exactly, only redirect a portion of what little they already gave, since abundance shared cost a household considerably less than scarcity endured alone. Nayla asked what would happen to Vesa's dawn miracle if half the district turned toward a fuller granary. Ilsa said gods rarely competed for attention. They found their proper level, as water always did. I asked her directly whether she considered Vesa a rival, and she said the word felt too harsh for what she actually intended, that she preferred to think of it as 2 temples serving 2 different hungers in the same tired district. She said honest measure fed the mind and the sense of fairness, while a full granary fed the stomach, and that a wise household kept both fed, rather than choosing between them out of loyalty alone. I could not immediately find a flaw in that reasoning, which unsettled me more than any argument would have, since I had grown used to opponents whose logic broke apart the moment I looked closely enough. Word of her offer ran down the row quicker than I expected, and by that same afternoon 3 households had already sent word that they intended to send a portion of their harvest east instead of keeping it entirely at home. Bettany said she understood the appeal completely, since a guaranteed full granary sounded considerably more restful than another season of watching a shrine's roof and a hero's luck both hold together by pure stubbornness. I could not fault the households who chose Ilsa's offer, not honestly, since a family that had survived a hard winter on hope alone had every right to choose certainty when certainty was finally offered to them. Perrin Doak was among the first to send word east, said his own ovens had run on borrowed flour too many seasons running, and that a guaranteed supply meant more to him now than another year of proving his loyalty to a shrine that could not yet promise the same. I answered that I understood completely and meant it, though the words cost something to say aloud that I had not expected them to cost. Halley, by contrast, said his own boats never once wanted for fish, regardless of which god watched over the district, and that he intended to keep his tithe where it had always gone, out of stubbornness as much as loyalty. Vesa, though, grew quieter over the following 2 days than I had seen her since the night I first met her, picking at her own portion of food without her usual running commentary on its weight. I asked what was wrong. She had watched other small gods lose their last worshippers to fuller temples, and losing them, one polite household at a time, hurt worse than seeing a demolition crew take them in a day. I told her Ilsa's offer was not an attack, only competition, and Vesa said competition and attack looked identical from where a forgotten god stood watching her own altar empty one household at a time. I asked her plainly what she actually wanted out of this, since in 2 months I had never once heard her ask for anything purely for her own sake, rather than for mine or Nayla's or the district's. She thought about that question longer than I expected, and finally said she wanted her own festival day back. One day a year, the district remembered belonged to her specifically, not shared, not borrowed, not overshadowed by a fuller granaries calendar. I told her that sounded like a reasonable thing to ask for, and she said reasonable had never once stopped her from being too proud to ask for it plainly before now. I went to Ilsa myself the next morning and told her Vesa wanted one full festival day of her own, unshared, in exchange for whatever tithe arrangement the two temples eventually settled between them. Ilsa considered the request with her usual warm patience. She saw no reason to deny a fellow god one day a year, provided the written arrangement kept both temples' worshippers clear about which blessing belonged to whom. The two of them met at the shrine that evening to settle the details themselves, and I watched, half amused and half unsettled, as two gods, who had never met before, began comparing the temples they had each once kept, back when both were still remembered properly. Ilsa said her old temple, before this one, had held a full 1,000 worshippers on festival days, robes and offerings stretching further than the eye could see from the altar steps. Vesa said her own temple, in its finest years, had held twice that number easily, though she admitted, after Ilsa raised an eyebrow, that the number might have grown somewhat larger with each retelling over 2 centuries of remembering it. Ilsa countered that her 1,000 had been a conservative count, closer to 1,500 on a good harvest festival, and Vesa immediately raised her own claim past 2,000 without so much as blinking. Nayla and I exchanged a look. We were watching two proud old gods lie to each other's faces about crowd sizes with the shameless confidence of market traders working on a gullible buyer. Ilsa pushed further still, said her old temple's harvest festival once ran 3 full days, with singers brought in from 4 provinces and a feast that fed the poor of 5 villages besides her own. Vesa, not to be outdone, said her own festival had once run a full week, with singers from every province anyone had bothered naming yet, and a feast so generous that neighboring gods sent envoys simply to watch it happen. I asked, mostly to see what would happen, whether either of them could name even one of these singers specifically, and both gods went suspiciously quiet at exactly the same moment. Ilsa finally laughed, a genuinely warm sound, and said she suspected neither of their true numbers would survive close examination, and that perhaps it was better, between gods at least, to let old glories stay comfortably unmeasured. Vesa agreed with visible relief, and the two gods shook hand to paw. Ilsa received the bulk of the district's grain tithe. Vesa received one unshared festival day, fixed on the calendar from that year forward. Nayla wrote Vesa's festival date into the shrine ledger before either god could revise the bargain. Then Bettany and Corin witnessed the line, turning a proud handshake into a promise the district could check after memories softened. By the week's end, 7 households had formally redirected their tithe toward Ilsa's temple, while roughly 24 stayed with Vesa's shrine instead. Some stayed out of loyalty, some out of simple stubborn preference for a god who ate what they ate rather than promising them more. Bettany said the split felt oddly healthy rather than defeating. two temples serving different needs for different families instead of one god pretending to be everything to everyone at once. Thorin, dating the arrangement by the same harvest he dated everything else, said he had never once seen two rival gods settle a dispute without a single drop of blood spilled over it, and called that, in his own quiet way, its own kind of miracle. I found myself agreeing, though a part of me still felt the sting of watching households I had personally helped choose a fuller granary over a shrine I had spent 2 months trying to keep standing. Pike told me plainly that a shareholder did not sulk over a fair trade honestly made, and that the households who left had every right to feed their children however they judged best, guild fight or no guild fight. Vesa seemed lighter once the arrangement was settled. One day named plainly as hers gave her more security than hoping vaguely that every household would remember her. 3 days after Ilsa's visit, Onder came running to the shrine breathless and reported that a line of carts had been seen on the eastern road, each one loaded high with spades, iron-headed and new, moving steadily toward Vetch Hollow. Ayla went very still at the news and asked whether the carts carried any other markings, and Onder said only guild gray canvas over the load, the same gray he had learned to recognize from the boundary chain men 2 months before. I stood at the shrine's broken wall that evening and watched the horizon in the direction Onder had pointed, and understood, without needing to see the carts myself yet, what a registry letter about permanent removal had actually meant all along. Vesa came to stand beside me at the wall, smaller than usual against the darkening sky, and said softly that spades meant the office intended to salt the ground once the shrine came down, so that nothing, not even memory, could take root here again. I asked how she knew that detail specifically, and she said she had watched it happen once before, a very long time ago, to a god whose name she still would not say aloud even now. Ayla took Vesa's silence about that old name as answer enough, and reached out to hold the small creature against her chest, as she might hold a frightened child, and none of us spoke again until well after dark. The carts arrived at first light, a dozen of them, workers riding alongside rather than soldiers, and at the head of the column walked a thin, unhurried man, carrying nothing more threatening than a folded document and a walking stick. He introduced himself as Oven Teal, Registrar of Gods for the province, and said he had not come to argue, only to carry out a decision that had already been made some months before Vesa was ever rediscovered. I asked what decision could possibly justify tearing down a shrine that was, by every visible measure, more alive now than it had been in 200 years, and he said that was, unfortunately, the question the registry no longer had the luxury of asking case by case. He said a god struck from the rolls and left unworshipped for years accumulates a debt no clean death ever collects, oil burned for no one, offerings left for no god who could use them, hope spent on a name that gave nothing back. I told him Vesa gave plenty back now, more than most licensed gods in the province likely managed, and he allowed that he did not doubt it, only that the registry's determination predated her return, and could not be undone by one man's testimony alone. Said the district's word was not proof the registry recognized, and that no paper I could produce and no crowd I could gather would substitute for the process that had already, months ago, sealed this shrine's fate. I asked whether there was any process left at all that could reverse a signed order once the spades had already left the capital. He said, honestly, that he did not know, since in his years of this work no district had ever managed to raise the question before the order was already carried out. Something in the way he said it, almost gently, told me he was not enjoying this, only performing a duty he had long ago stopped questioning for himself. I asked him, since he seemed to value numbers as much as I did, to explain what debt he meant, and he said he would rather I calculated it myself, since a man who trusted numbers ought to trust the ones that damned his own cause as readily as the ones that served it. He asked how long the shrine had stood struck off the register before Vesa returned to it, and Nayla, standing close beside me, answered before I could, her voice steady, though her hands were not. She said 7 years, since the season her mother died in that same broken building, and that she had kept a single lamp lit there every night since, out of grief rather than worship, because leaving it dark had felt like losing her mother twice. Teal asked how much oil a lamp like that consumed in 7 years, and Nayla, to my surprise, answered that too, precisely, the way a woman answers a question she has clearly asked herself many times before, in the dark. She named the amount, and Teal converted it aloud, calmly, into its worth in bread at the district's own prices, a sum that would have fed a family of 4 for the better part of 2 full winters. He asked me directly, in front of the gathering crowd, how many households in this district had gone hungry over those same 7 years, and I said I did not have an exact count, only the certainty that some had, every winter, without fail. He said an approximate answer would not do. That someone who had spent the last months proving other men's numbers false owed this particular number the same honesty, and asked me to work it properly, aloud, before he gave the order to begin. Thought of Bettany's ovens running short, of Anders' hunger before he ever earned a meal honestly, of the winter Corin had described losing half his own household's grain to a bad harvest no one could have prevented. I built the number the only way I knew how, piece by verified piece, refusing to round a single figure in either direction. By the time I finished, the figure stood plainly in front of everyone, a specific number of hunger days across 7 winters that the same oil, spent differently, could have shortened for real families with real names. I had no honest way to argue the number down because it was true, built the same way I had built every other number I had ever put my name to in this district, and Teal had known before he ever asked what kind of man he was asking. He said, not unkindly, that this was precisely his point, that a small forgotten god cost the living more than most people ever notice, and that a clean death, given now, spared this district 7 more years of the same slow bleeding. I asked why a man who clearly believed his own argument still bothered making it aloud instead of simply carrying out the order in silence. He said a decision this final deserved to be understood, even by the people it hurt, and especially by the ones smart enough to check his arithmetic afterward. Corin, who had arrived partway through the exchange leaning on a boy's shoulder for guidance, said softly that he had never once, in 30 years of milling, met a man who dressed cruelty so carefully in the clothing of kindness. Teal accepted the observation without any visible offense at all, the way a man accepts weather he stopped arguing with long ago. He said he had heard worse descriptions of his work from better men than Coran, and that he had stopped taking any of them personally a long time before either of them had been born. Nayla asked him whether Vessa's return, however recent, did not change the calculation at all, and Teal said it might someday through the registry's proper process, but that today's order had already been signed before that question could be formally asked. I told him the district needed more time to make that case through whatever process he claimed existed, and he said time was what a struck God's shrine no longer had the right to ask for, under the same law that had struck it in the first place. He gave the order quietly, without ceremony, and his workers moved to the shrine's broken wall with the practiced efficiency of men who had clearly done this exact work in other districts before ours. The first spade struck stone within minutes, a dull, final sound that carried further across the morning air than I expected a single blow to carry. Nayla flinched at the sound the way a person flinches at a wound landing on someone they love, and I understood, watching her, that the number I had just built out loud had cost her something no bread could ever repay. I asked Teal what he felt while destroying a shrine that had done more good in 2 months than most temples managed in a lifetime. He said his office dealt in numbers rather than feelings, and today's numbers belonged to him. By mid-morning, a full section of the outer wall lay in broken pieces, and the workers moved with the same steady rhythm regardless of the small crowd that had gathered to watch, silent, unable to stop what a signed order had already set in motion. Anders stood at the edge of the crowd with his 3 boys, silent for once. No one had to tell those 4 boys that their usual noise had no place beside a falling shrine wall. One of the workers, a broad-shouldered man who looked no happier about the task than the rest of his crew, paused near me long enough to say quietly that he had torn down 6 shrines this year already. He said this one, at least, had put up more of a fight than most before the spades ever arrived, and he meant it as something close to a compliment. I asked what he meant by a fight, and he said most struck shrines his crew found were already empty ruins nobody defended, and that watching an actual crowd gather to grieve, one felt to him like a kind of proof the registry's paperwork never seemed to account for. Vessa sat on the altar stone through all of it, very still, watching the wall come down piece by piece with an expression I had not seen on her before, something closer to old grief than to fear. I asked her quietly whether this was what had happened to the god she would not name, and she said close enough, though that one had gone faster, with fewer witnesses and no honest man forced to say the number aloud first. She said she had been young then, by the measure gods used for such things, and had watched from a neighboring hillside because she had not yet been brave enough to stand close to a death she feared might one day be her own. I asked whether she was brave enough now, and she said she did not know yet, only that she intended to sit where she was sitting until the last stone fell, whatever that decision turned out to cost her. Teal overheard that, or perhaps simply guessed at it, and said, without looking up from his work, that a witnessed death was, in his considerable experience, still kinder than the alternative, whatever comfort that might or might not offer either of us. By early afternoon, Bettany appeared at the shrine's edge, took one long look at the broken wall and the working men, and left again without a word to anyone, gathering 3 of her own women from the row as she went. Nayla asked where she had gone, and I said I did not know, only that Bettany rarely left anywhere in a hurry without a plan already forming behind her eyes, and that I intended to trust that instinct until it gave me a reason not to. Tally sent word not long after that his own boats were pulling in early for the night, no explanation offered beyond a shrug from the boy who carried the message, and I began to suspect Bettany's silent errand was gathering more than just 3 women. Teal called his workers off as the light finally failed, said the crew would rest through the night, and finish the demolition properly at first light. Since tired hands made careless mistakes, he preferred not to answer for. I asked whether that meant we had until dawn, and he said it meant that no more, and that he did not expect the extra hours to change anything either of us already understood about how this would end. We stood together at what remained of the shrine as the light began to fail, half a wall gone, a true number now hanging over all of us that none of us could honestly unmake, and no argument left between us and whatever the next spade struck down by morning. Pike arrived after dark, having heard the news second-hand from one of Onder's boys, and stood looking at the broken stone for a long while, before he said quietly that an ox had once held a gate shut against worse odds than one night's head start. I said I did not see how an ox helped against a signed order, and a crew that had clearly done this exact work in other districts many times before. He said he did not know either, only that giving up before morning felt like the one option none of us could actually afford to choose. I did not sleep, and neither did Nayla, and somewhere past the deepest part of the night, I heard footsteps approaching the shrine from 3 directions at once, too many for trouble and too orderly for panic. Bettany arrived first, a full dozen women behind her, each one carrying a sack of flour and a set of scales borrowed from her own oven, and began setting up a working way station against the unbroken half of the wall before the sky had even started to gray. I asked what she intended to prove by weighing flour at this hour, and she said she intended to prove the district still worked, loudly, publicly, and in front of the one man whose signature could still undo all of it. Corin arrived next, led by his daughter Mara, and behind them came a small cart loaded with his mill's own grinding stones, enough to demonstrate a working measure even without the mill itself standing here. Trice followed with a small coil spun from scraps and borrowed fiber since Hask's buyout. It could not support a full trade, yet it gave everyone present a measured length to check. Pike brought his whole ox team, yoked and ready, and positioned them at the shrine's entrance, the way a man positions a fact he intends to make impossible to argue around. Adava arrived last, her bandaged hand held carefully against her chest, carrying the 6 scales she had marked with her own unlicensed stamp, each one wrapped and ready to be shown. By the time the sky had gone from black to gray, the shrine's ruined courtyard had become something between a marketplace and a proof. Every trade the district actually ran laid out in plain sight for anyone who cared to look. Onder and his 3 boys moved through the gathering counting heads and goods both, and reported back to me that at least 40 people had turned out before full light, more than had ever gathered for any single stall on any single market day I could remember. Nayla stood at the shrine's threshold, watching it all assemble, and said her mother, who had kept this same broken building alone for years before her, would never have believed it could hold this many honest hands at once. Teal's workers stirred first, drawn by the noise, and hung back at the rim of the gathering, with their spades still in hand, uncertain, glancing back toward the tent where their master still slept. Teal himself emerged not long after, fully dressed despite the early hour, and stood a long moment surveying the courtyard before he said a single word to any of us. His workers looked to him for instruction, spades still loose in their hands, and he told them plainly to wait, that a registrar who ordered a demolition without first looking properly at what he was demolishing had no business calling his own work careful. Teal's honesty unsettled me. The day before he had forced me to count the district's hunger aloud without flinching. Now he had stopped his own workers to examine new evidence. He walked the length of Bettany's way station first, watched 2 of her women check a sack of flour against each other's scales without a word passing between them, both numbers agreeing to the last grain. He moved to Trice's laid rope next, measured it himself against his own walking stick, and found the length true to what she claimed for it, despite the thinness of her current stock. He tested Corin's grinding stones with his own hands, feeling the true weight of measured grain against measured flour, and Corin, guided by Mara's quiet direction, answered every question Teal asked without a single moment of hesitation. He examined one of Adava's 6 stamped scales longest of all, turning it over, checking the mark against the light, and asked her plainly whether she understood that the stamp itself remained, by guild law, entirely illegal. She said she understood completely, having already paid for it with 2 fingers, and that she would cut the same die again tomorrow if the district asked her to, law or no law. Teal said nothing to that for a long moment, only looked at her bandaged hand, then at the 6 honest scales scattered through the crowd, silent evidence of a district measuring itself true, without waiting for anyone's permission to do so. He asked me finally how long this had all been running: the ovens, the mill, the rope, the oxen, the stamp, working together as one system rather than as separate trades that happened to share a market row. I told him honestly that it had grown piece by piece since the first morning I arrived with nothing but a beam and a rope, not designed all at once, only built as each new need demanded a new, honest answer. He said the registry's determination pictured an empty shrine, a forgotten god, and oil burned for no reason. It had never accounted for a working institution growing around the shrine in 2 months. I told him the number I had calculated the day before was still true, still honest, and that I had no wish to argue him out of a fact simply because a newer fact had grown up beside it since. He said that was, in his considerable experience, the most honest thing anyone had ever said to him in the middle of trying to save a shrine from his own spades, and his expression changed, slightly, in a way it had not once done since he arrived. He turned to his workers and told them plainly to stand down, that the demolition was suspended pending a full report to the registry. That report, he said, he intended to write himself, based on what he had personally witnessed this morning, rather than on what a signed order months old had assumed. Teal asked Onder for the names of every household using the new measures, and for 3 weeks of market counts. The boys scattered at once. Within an hour, his report had flour totals, rope lengths, cart numbers, and witnesses instead of a crowd's bare claim that the shrine mattered. A ragged cheer went up from the gathered district, and Nayla, standing beside me, let out a breath I think she had been holding since the first spade struck stone the day before. Teal raised a hand before the celebration grew too loud. Suspension was different from reversal, he warned. His report carried weight without certainty, and one morning's mercy did not settle the matter. I told him the difference was clear enough, and that a suspended sentence was still considerably more than we had woken up with that same morning, worth celebrating honestly even if not yet fully. Adava said quietly that a suspended sentence was still more mercy than her own hand had ever received from any registry, and that she intended to enjoy the district's small victory, regardless of how the wider argument eventually settled. By mid-morning, with the crew stood down and Teal himself gone to draft his report in the shade of his own tent, the district turned its energy toward rebuilding what the previous day's spades had already broken. Women who had carried flour scales hours before now carried stone instead, passing broken wall pieces hand to hand back into place, while Pike's oxen dragged fresh stone up from the riverbank to fill the gaps. In the middle of the rebuilding, an argument broke out among Bettany, Coran, Trice, Pike, and Adava over which of their 5 measures the district ought to trust most completely, if it ever had to choose only one. Bettany insisted flour scales, checked twice daily against each other, could never drift false without someone noticing within a single morning, and that immediacy made hers the truest standard available. Coran said a mill's stones, ground the same way for 30 years running, held a consistency no daily scale could match, though he admitted, fairly, that his own eyes could no longer verify it without help. Trice said a measured rope never lied about length regardless of what it weighed, and that length, unlike weight, could not be quietly adjusted by anyone clever enough to hollow out a stone. Pike said none of their arguments mattered if the oxen refused to move the goods those measures were meant to protect, and that transport, not accuracy, was the true foundation everything else stood on. Adava, holding up her bandaged hand, said a stamp that had already cost 2 fingers to defend clearly outweighed every other argument in the yard, and the other 4 fell into an argument with her about that too. Bettany said pain proved conviction, not accuracy, and that she would trade every one of Adava's stamps for one more honest scale checked daily by someone with all 10 fingers still attached to use it. Pike failed to referee the argument and finally shouted that the district needed all 5 of them. Choosing which single measure mattered most was like asking which ox pulled the greater share of a yoke built for 2. Trice said that was, infuriatingly, the first sensible thing anyone had said in the last quarter hour, and the argument finally dissolved into laughter rather than resolution, which suited the mood of the whole strange morning better than any actual answer would have. I stood back, and watched 5 honest people argue passionately about which honest thing mattered most, and found the sound of it, oddly, more reassuring than any single one of their answers could have been alone. Vesa, perched on a fresh-cut stone nearby, watched the whole argument with visible amusement, and said that a district capable of arguing this fiercely over honesty was a district unlikely to lose it easily to anyone, guild or registry both. I sat with her a while after the wall building slowed for the midday heat, and found myself asking a question I had never once let myself ask aloud in 2 full months since we first met. I asked her, plainly, whether her power could reach far enough to fix what Seth Boland had done to my own name, the ledger, the 40 dead men, the brand still cut into my ear. She fell silent. I knew she was judging how much truth I wanted and how much it would cost, and she did not answer before the evening light failed. Nayla found us both sitting there in the dusk, unspeaking, and asked what question had managed to silence a god who had never once, in 2 months, run short of something to say. I told her, and she sat down on my other side without another word, and the 3 of us stayed like that a long while, watching the rebuilt half of the wall hold its new stone steady against a sky finally gone fully dark. I did not press Vesa again that night for an answer, understanding, somewhere underneath the hope I had not let myself feel until I finally asked the question aloud, that some silences carried their own kind of honest answer already. Word of the question I had finally asked spread through the row faster than any market news I had ever caused, and by the next evening a small crowd had already gathered at the shrine, waiting for the dawn everyone assumed I intended to spend on myself. Nayla found me alone at the broken wall the night before and asked, plainly, whether I understood what I was about to do, spending the one thing this district relied on every single day on a question that might not even have an honest answer. I told her I understood what I was risking, and that after 2 months of fixing everyone else's crooked measures, I had earned one morning to ask about my own. She did not argue the point directly, only said that earning something and being wise to spend it were not always the same thing, and that she would stand beside me regardless of which one this turned out to be. Adava arrived not long after, her bandaged hand still healing, and said flatly that she had lost 2 fingers, proving the district could measure honestly without waiting on anyone's mercy. She said, spending a dawn chasing a personal hope felt, to her, like the wrong lesson to teach a district that had only just learned to stand on its own. I asked her what she would have me do instead, carry the brand forever, without ever once asking whether it could be lifted, and she said she would have me ask on a morning when no one else's case stood waiting behind mine in line. I told her there was no such morning. There never had been, and that waiting for a perfect time to ask had already cost me 2 months. I was not willing to spend waiting any longer. She said 2 fingers had taught her that waiting was not always the coward's choice people assumed it was, and I told her I did not think her a coward for waiting, only that I was not built the same way she was. She looked at me a long moment and said that was, unfortunately, the kind of difference that got people hurt, and turned away before I could answer her properly. Bettany said an old widow named Gret Hallam had waited 3 days for her turn at the dawn. A debt collector was about to seize her last 3 sheep over a wool weight she swore had been recorded wrong. I told Bettany I had not known that, and she admitted she had been holding the request back gently, hoping to find a quieter morning to bring it forward, since Gret's case, unlike mine, actually had a crooked measure behind it that Vesa could plainly fix. I stood with that fact a long moment, feeling the shape of the choice in front of me clearly for the first time, my own hope on one side and an old woman's 3 remaining sheep on the other. That evening, I asked Vesa which case she was more likely to fix. She did not know until she tried. Forgery and mismeasure sometimes wore the same face until her power touched them. I chose my own name anyway, and I have turned that choice over in my mind more times since than I care to admit, weighing it the way I once weighed every sack and coin that crossed my path, and never once landing on an answer that made the weighing easier. At first light, with the small crowd gathered and quiet, I stood at the altar and asked Vesa plainly to lift the charge of Sedgeford from my name, the 40 dead, the rewritten ledger, the brand cut into my ear for a crime that was never mine to own. She touched the altar stone the way she always did, and I watched her reach for the correction the same way I had watched her reach for Nayla's debt on the very first morning I met her, certain and practiced. Nothing happened. The dawn light strengthened around us, ordinary and unbroken, and Vesa's paw stayed pressed against cold stone, with no answer arriving beneath it at all. She tried again, longer this time, her whole small body gone rigid with effort, and still nothing came. no correction, no lifted weight, only the same brand and the same name and the same 40 dead men waiting where they had always waited. She finally sat back, breathing hard as though she had run some great distance, rather than simply reached for a single correction, and said quietly that she could not do it, that there was nothing crooked here for her hands to fix. She said the count at Sedgeford had been true when I signed it, every grain accounted for honestly, and that the wrong done to me afterward was a man's deliberate lie laid over an honest number, not a bad measure at all. She said her gift touched only wrong measure, never a lie told about a measure that had been right all along, and that this single, narrow limit was the one thing in 200 years she had never once found a way around. I asked, my voice not entirely steady, whether she had known this from the start, whether she had let me hope anyway, because she had not wanted to be the one to take the hope away from me first. She said she had suspected it from the very night I first told her about Sedgeford, and had said nothing because a hope, even a false one, had kept me moving through weeks that might otherwise have broken a lesser man. Until tonight, she had not known how to weigh that older kindness fairly against the fresh cost it had just produced for Gret. I did not have an answer for that either, only the strange, hollow understanding that a God who could not lie had still, in her own way, protected me with a silence that came very close to the same thing. I stood before the gathered crowd with my ear still branded and my name still stolen. The cost was plain. I had spent a widow's only chance at mercy to confirm a truth I already half suspected. Nayla took my hand in front of them all, and I let her, too hollowed out in that moment to manage any pride about needing it. Within the hour, one of Anders' boys came at a dead run with Bettany's message. Gret Hallam's creditor had taken the 3 sheep that morning, unwilling to wait another day after her case missed its turn at the district's only mercy. I went to Gret that afternoon and found her sitting on an empty pen, dry-eyed and spent. Whatever tears she had were gone on losses that came before this one. She did not blame me, which somehow made the entire morning worse rather than better. Only said she understood a man had his own name to worry about, same as she had her own sheep, and that she did not begrudge me the choice, only the cost of it landing on her instead. I told her I would find some way to make it right, and she said kindness after the fact rarely fed a household through the coming winter, though she thanked me for the offer regardless. Pike, hearing of it later that same day, offered to buy her 3 replacement sheep himself out of the venture's own small profit, and I agreed immediately, grateful for a debt I could actually still pay, even if I could not undo the original loss. Gret accepted the sheep 2 days later with the same dry-eyed practicality she had shown at the empty pen, and said a district that noticed its own mistakes quickly enough was still worth more than one that never made any at all. I carried that failure for days. Vale and Hask had forced losses on me. This one came from a choice I had made with open eyes, for my own sake. I understood, sitting there, that I had spent 2 months teaching this district to trust one man's beam and one woman's dawn, and that trusting either of us alone had just cost an old widow her whole flock over my own hope. Before dark that same evening, I gathered Nayla, Bettany, and Adiva together, and told them plainly what I intended to do about it. The reference weight set I had built and calibrated over these 2 months, the one every disputed scale in the district got checked against when argument alone could not settle it, would no longer belong to one man's hands. I split it myself, in front of all 3 of them, 4 separate pieces cut from the same true standard, no piece complete enough alone to certify anything, without the other 3 brought together to confirm it. I gave one piece to Nayla, keeper of the shrine where the district's honesty had first taken root, one to Bettany, whose ovens had fed the venture through every hard week, one to Adiva, who had paid in blood for the district's right to measure itself. I kept the 4th piece myself, not as the final word any longer, only as one voice among 4, none of us able to certify a true measure again, without the other 3 standing beside us to confirm it. We tested the division before anyone carried a piece away. Bettany and Adiva joined theirs first. The results stayed incomplete until Nayla and I added ours. Only then did the 4 edges confirm the standard, exactly as I intended. Nayla asked what this meant for the 8 days I would be gone. The district could now measure honestly without me, I said, because its standard no longer depended on one pair of hands surviving the road to the garrison and back. Adiva turned her own piece over in her uninjured fingers and said quietly that this was the first thing I had done in 2 months that she had no argument left to make against. Bettany weighed her own piece in her palm, testing its heft the way she tested a sack of flour, and said she intended to keep it in the same drawer as her ledger, close enough to reach in an argument, far enough to never mistake for a personal possession. Nayla held hers without speaking. Her mother had spent a lifetime keeping one broken shrine standing alone, holding 1/4 of the district's honesty, felt like the first inheritance Nayla had chosen for herself. I told all three of them plainly that I trusted this arrangement more than I had ever trusted my own hands alone, and Bettany said that admission alone was probably worth more to the district than the weights themselves. Word reached us the following morning, through Anders boys and their usual careful channels, that Cyril Hask had somehow already learned of my planned journey. Hask welcomed the news of my planned absence. A man who never spent coin on a useless grudge would not be pleased unless the empty road served a purpose. I could not read what that meant yet, only that a man who never wasted a single coin on a grudge that did not serve him was unlikely to feel satisfaction over my absence, without a reason I had not yet been given time enough to find. Ike said he intended to come with me as far as the provincial border, regardless of what Hask was planning, and I did not argue, grateful for once not to be facing 8 unknown days entirely alone. Pike walked with me as far as the provincial border. 3 days of quiet road broken mostly by the sound of his ox and by Vessa's running commentary on the true weight of every milestone we passed. He turned back at the border with a short, hard handshake and a promise to keep the district's 4 scattered weights honest until I made it home again. And I watched him and his ox grow small on the road behind me, longer than I meant to. The remaining 5 days passed, the way hard roads always pass, one foot after another, Vessa riding hidden in my pack during daylight and complaining bitterly each evening about the indignity of travel by canvas. Crossed into Hask's own province on the 6th day, and I kept my head down through the one toll gate we could not avoid, paying an ordinary traveler's toll and drawing no more notice than any other tired foot traveler on the road. The warden there barely glanced at me twice, more interested in a string of loaded merchant carts waiting behind me than in one branded man on foot. And I found myself grateful, for once, that Hask's operation ran too smoothly to notice small things. I slept that night in a roadside barn with strangers bound for the same provincial market, and listened to 2 of them argue about a grain contract that had recently changed hands, unaware they were describing, in rough outline, the exact venture I had left behind me. Vessa, from inside my pack, muttered that the 2 men's own boots weighed more than their argument was worth, and I had to press a hand flat against the canvas to keep her quiet before either man noticed the pack was talking. The garrison at Sedge Ford came into view on the morning of the 8th day, a squat fortification of gray stone that I had not laid eyes on since the day they marched me south from it, with a fresh cut on my ear. I stood at the edge of the tree line a long while before I found the nerve to approach the gate, memory pressing harder against me than I expected after 6 years of trying not to think about this exact stretch of road. The guard at the gate looked me over with the flat suspicion garrisons reserve for strangers, until his eyes caught the brand on my ear, and something in his expression shifted from suspicion into something closer to recognition. He asked where I had gotten a cut like that, and I told him plainly the same 4 sentences I had once used to open my own account of myself to a stranger in a broken shrine 2 months before. He introduced himself as Odo Brill, said he had stood this same gate the season the Sedgeford count went wrong, and that he remembered the particular shape of the cut because he had watched the officer make it himself. I asked whether he remembered anything else from that season, and he went quiet a long moment, glancing back toward the garrison's inner yard before he answered, careful in a way that told me the answer cost him something to give. He admitted he had always thought the official account of that count sat strangely, too clean, too quickly settled, though a guard's opinion had never once been worth much against a captain general's own brother's word. He said the officer who cut my ear that day had seemed uneasy doing it, glancing more than once toward the garrison's own commander, as though checking for a signal to stop, and that the commander had never once given it. I asked what became of that officer. Brill said he transferred within the season, and no one at the garrison spoke his name again. The whole post seemed to have agreed to forget the matter as quickly as possible. I said I had not come back for opinions, only for one specific thing. The other half of a tally stick split the day I was marched south, and asked whether the garrison still kept old supply records in its stores. He said the garrison's own chest held current accounts only, but that an older chest, sealed and rarely opened, sat in a side room used to store the supply contractor's private records, separate from the garrison's own books. I asked whose chest that actually was, and he said after another careful pause that the garrison's grain and supply contract belonged to a merchant house out of the capital, run these past several years by a man named Seth Boland. Hearing the name spoken plainly, in this exact place, after 6 years of carrying it only as a shape in my own memory, hit harder than I expected it to, and I had to stand a moment with one hand against the gatepost before I trusted my voice again. Brill said he could not simply hand a stranger access to a contractor's private stores, not without risking his own position, and possibly worse if anyone above him learned he had allowed it. I assured him I understood completely, and that I would not ask him to risk more than he was willing to spend, though I could not pretend the request cost me nothing to make either. He considered it a long while, looking at my ear again, and finally said he would let me in after the evening watch changed, quietly, on the condition that whatever I found, I never spoke his name in connection with it. I agreed without hesitation, and spent the hours until evening watch hidden in a supply shed at the edge of camp with Vesa, who found the whole arrangement considerably less exciting than she clearly felt it deserved to be. She kept insisting on peeking out through gaps in the shed wall to comment on passing soldiers, and twice I had to physically pull her back from the door before a passing guard caught sight of a talking creature where no talking creature had any business being. At one point, unable to help herself, she announced in a stage whisper that the ration sack a passing quartermaster carried held a full quarter less grain than its own posted weight, shorted the same way half the sacks in Vetch Hollow once were. I told her to be quiet before she got us both discovered, and she said quiet had never once fed a hungry soldier either, though she did, grudgingly, lower her voice for the rest of the wait. A young soldier passed close enough to the shed that I could hear his stomach complaining through the wall, and Vesa, unable to help herself even at a whisper, said his own portion that morning had been shorted by nearly a third against what his rank was owed. I asked how she could possibly know that from inside a closed shed, and she said hunger had a smell all its own, one she had learned to recognize across 2 centuries of watching people go without, and that a soldier's hunger smelled no different from a farmer's. The same contractor's hand had reached all the way from Sedgeford to Vetch Hollow, shorting hungry soldiers as readily as it had shorted a struggling district. Brill came for us once full dark had settled, and led us through a side door into a narrow storage room stacked with ledgers and sealed chests, dust thick enough to show that few hands had disturbed this particular corner in years. The contractor's chest sat at the back, locked, though Brill produced a key from his own belt and said garrison guards kept spare keys to every lock on the grounds, a fact I suspected he was not technically supposed to admit to a stranger. His hands were not entirely steady on the lock, and I asked whether he wanted to step outside and let me search alone, so that whatever I found would sit on my own conscience rather than his. He said he had come this far already, and that a man who backed out of a risk halfway through had usually already paid the worst part of the cost for nothing, and finished turning the key himself. The lid opened onto years of grain counts and delivery notes heaped without order, the dust and neglect of an office certain no outsider would ever look closely. Inside, beneath years of loose paperwork, I found a length of pale wood, split lengthwise down its grain, notched at even spans exactly the way my father had once notched his own counting rod. This was exactly how the garrison's tallyman split every stick, sending half out with the grain and keeping half behind as a check. Compared it with the half I remembered carrying before it was taken from me. Brill examined the wood under his lamp and said the grain pattern would settle any argument over whether the 2 pieces had once been 1 stick. I asked where my own half might have ended up, since it had been taken from me the same day they cut my ear, and Brill said confiscated property from that season would have been filed here too, in this same chest, if it had been filed at all. He searched a little further through the loose papers, and beneath a bundle tied with contractor's cord, we found a second length of the same pale wood, notched at the same even spans. My own half surrendered the week I was marched south and never once opened since. I held both pieces together in the lamplight, cut edge to cut edge, and even by eye alone the grain seemed to want to flow from one piece into the other, 6 years apart, and still remembering the same tree. Before closing the chest, Brill copied the shelf mark, the contractor's seal, and the cord around the papers onto a scrap he signed himself. The wood could prove the count, but his small record would prove where both halves had been found. Brill refused to swear to the match because he lacked training for the reading. Even so, he said no judge would find much room to argue once both halves sat side by side. I asked him to keep it safe one more night, since carrying it out through the front gate in darkness felt riskier than waiting for a clearer path home, and he agreed reluctantly, clearly aware of exactly how much he had already risked simply by letting me this far. We left the storage room the way we had entered it, quiet, unseen, Brill carrying both halves back to whatever safe corner he trusted, and I spent that night in the same supply shed turning the discovery over in my mind, until sleep finally took the choice away from me. Woke before dawn to the sound of horses moving fast through the garrison yard, more urgency in the noise than any ordinary morning patrol should have carried, and Vesa, already awake, said the sound meant riders leaving in a hurry, not arriving. I did not yet know whether the riders rode out because of me or Brill, or some entirely unrelated garrison matter. Only that the sudden noise sat wrong enough in my stomach that I gathered my few things and made ready to move the moment full light allowed it. Vesa, tucked into my pack, said the horses carried men riding toward a destination, not exercising their mounts. Whatever waited at the far end of that ride, she added, would bring bad news for both of us. Brill met me at the shed door before full light, both halves of the tally stick wrapped in oilcloth under his arm, his face tight in a way that told me the overnight riders had carried news neither of us was going to like. He pressed the bundle into my hands quickly, said he had kept his word and guarded it through the night, and that whatever came next, it was mine to carry now, not his. He said word had reached the garrison commander that a branded stranger had been seen entering the contractor's storage room after dark, and that riders had already gone out to alert whoever in the region kept an interest in Boland's business affairs. I asked how quickly that interest was likely to reach the road ahead of me, and Brill said grimly that a man with Cyril Hask's reach across this province could likely have riders waiting well before I crossed back into his own territory. The first 5 days retraced the same hard ground I had already crossed once, both halves of the tally stick wrapped tight against my chest the entire way, and nothing troubled the road until the morning I crossed back into Hask's own province. He was right about the waiting. I had not gone 3 hours past that border stone before a small party of mounted men fell into step alongside me, unhurried, blocking the road ahead without ever drawing a weapon. Hask himself rode at their center, dressed for travel rather than for market, and greeted me with the same unsettling calm he had used the very first time he offered to buy my future outright. He said he understood I had found something interesting in a certain contractor's chest, and that he had come personally to discuss what that discovery might be worth to both of us. I told him plainly it was not for sale, and he said he had not yet named a price, only wanted to point out that a stick's testimony, however honest, still required a witness willing to carry it home safely. He said he could arrange, through channels considerably faster and cleaner than any tally stick, to have my name formally cleared by the guild itself within the week. Brand lifted, record wiped, no 8-day road required at all. I asked what such a clean resolution would cost me, and he said only my silence regarding whatever else I might have learned about Boland's current arrangements with this particular garrison. I understood, standing there on that empty road, exactly what he was actually offering. My own name back in exchange for letting a contractor go on shorting hungry soldiers, same as he had once shorted a whole district's grain count. I asked him directly why a man who claimed never to act from spite would spend this much effort protecting a contractor's fraud that had nothing obvious to do with his own province's business. He said Boland's contract touched several arrangements he preferred kept quiet, and that a public scandal over shorted soldiers would draw exactly the kind of scrutiny that made his own province's other quiet arrangements considerably harder to manage. I told him that sounded less like protecting Boland and more like protecting himself, and he said, without any visible offense, that the two had become difficult to separate in his line of work a long time ago. I told him no, the same word I had given him in the market row weeks before. His disappointment was slight and exact, like a calculation that had missed by one coin. He said most men, offered their own name back cleanly, took the easier road without much hesitation, and I said I was apparently determined to keep proving myself the exception to whatever pattern he had built his whole business on. He said very well then, and turned his horse without further argument, though he added, almost as an afterthought, that the road ahead grew considerably harder to travel once his patience for a particular stranger finally ran out. I asked whether that was a threat, and he said it was simply an observation, the kind a patient man made once before deciding a conversation had run its useful course. He rode a short distance off and spoke softly to two mounted men. One pointed toward the road ahead, while the other watched me, his hand resting on the saddle. I did not wait to find out what that meant. I left the road entirely within the hour, cutting cross-country toward the river fords I had crossed with Pike weeks before. The only route I knew that Hask's men were unlikely to expect. Pike, true to his own promise, had ridden back out from Vetch Hollow to meet the road around the day he judged I was due, and I found him waiting at the near bank of the first ford, ox already yoked, as though he had been counting the same days I had. The moment he heard what had happened on the road behind me, he turned his ox team around without a single question about whether helping was wise. We ran the fords at a pace that felt reckless to me and entirely too cautious to the men now visibly gaining on us from the road above, and I shouted at Pike more than once to drive the animals harder. He refused every single time. Flatly, said an ox pushed past its own sense would panic in the current and drown us both along with whatever we were carrying, and that a slower crossing that actually succeeded beat a faster one that did not. I argued with him from one bank to the other as Hask's riders gained behind us. Pike kept the same steady pace, unmoved by my shouting and the closing distance. I told him plainly that a stick this important was worth risking a drowned ox over, and he said a drowned ox meant a stranded cart, a lost cargo, and both of us caught on foot regardless of how important the stick was. He allowed that he had lost one animal to a rushed crossing in 20 years of droving, and that the memory of it had taught him more about patience than any argument I could shout at him from the back of his own cart. I fell quiet after that, understanding, somewhere underneath the fear driving my voice, that his stubbornness was the same stubbornness that had once held a county gate shut for half a day, and that arguing with it now would only slow us both down further. We cleared the third and final ford with the riders still a full field behind us. Unable to risk their horses on a crossing, Pike's oxen had clearly learned to read better than any mounted stranger could manage on his first attempt. Aunt Marrow watched the whole chase from her own doorway, arms crossed, and once we were safely across, she walked out to the riverbank and told the riders, plainly, that her land welcomed no one who came at a gallop with weapons visible. The riders held at the far bank, unwilling to force the crossing against a landholder's open refusal, and Marrow stood watching them until they finally turned back the way they had come, muttering among themselves every step of the way. One of them called across the water that their business concerned a stranger, not the widow's land, and Marrow called back that anyone crossing her fords uninvited became her business the moment their horses touched her bank. Vesa emerged from my pack and shouted after the retreating riders that their mounts carried at least a stone of useless armor apiece. That, she added, explained how they had lost a race to 2 oxen. I thanked her once my breath had returned enough to manage it, and she said she had not done it for me particularly, only that she disliked armed strangers treating her land like a public road, and that the timing had simply worked out in my favor. We reached Vetch Hollow by the following evening, and word of my return outran me down the row before I could walk it myself, until half the district had gathered at the shrine before I even finished crossing the threshold. Nayla reached me first and held my arm until the shaking passed. I was too relieved to see her to pretend I did not need the support. She asked whether the 8 days had justified their cost. I would know once Adeva finished her reading, though with both halves of the stick finally in one place, I found it hard to regret the road. Bettany pressed a fresh loaf into my hands before I had even finished greeting half the row. Said a man who had run from armed riders across 3 fords deserved to eat something before he answered a single question. Adeva examined both halves of the stick under full daylight the next morning, turning them slowly, checking the grain against itself, the way she had once checked Vale's forged impressions against Corin's book. She said the pattern matched cleanly along the whole length of the cut. No hesitation in the wood, no sign of any tampering, and that she would swear to the match before any court or crowd the district cared to gather. Odo Brill arrived 3 days later, having ridden the whole distance himself after being quietly released from garrison duty for the unauthorized access he had granted a stranger to a contractor's private stores. He said he had known the cost before he ever turned the key, and that he had come anyway to testify in person that the receipt, the chest, and both halves were exactly what I claimed them to be. I asked what he intended to do now, without a garrison post to return to, and he answered that he had heard on the long ride here that a district that had just broken 2 corrupt waymasters might have some use for a man who knew how to keep an honest ledger. Bettany said she could use another set of hands checking flour deliveries, and Brill accepted at once. His relief showed before he could hide it. He had expected to arrive with nothing and found work waiting. With Adeva's expert reading and Brill's own testimony standing together before the gathered district, the charge against my name from Sedge Ford was declared, publicly and finally, a forgery rather than a failure, and struck from every account that had ever carried it. Word reached us within the week that Boland had lost the garrison supply contract entirely, The province's own quartermasters unwilling to keep trading with a contractor whose fraud had just been proven this thoroughly, this publicly. Under brought one more piece of news soon after, that the guild's remaining presence near Vetch Hollow, the last watchful man still stationed on the district's edge since Hask's own visits began, had been quietly recalled toward the provincial capital. I asked Nayla whether that meant the guild had finally given up on the district entirely, and she said, with a caution I had come to trust completely, that a recall rarely meant surrender in her experience, only that a losing hand had decided to deal a different one. Adava, still holding both halves of the stick gently in her good hand, said she intended to keep them safe at her own forge until the district decided what permanent record ought to be made of the match, and no one argued the choice with her. Market gates had gone 9 days now without a licensed weighmaster of any kind, and the district, rather than falling apart the way I half expected, had simply kept going without one. Households brought disputed weights to whichever of the 4 reference holders stood nearest, and more often than not, the dispute settled itself before anyone needed to walk the piece all the way to Adiva's forge for a formal reading. I asked Corin one afternoon whether he thought the district actually needed a single licensed weighmaster ever again, and he said the question answered itself the moment you noticed how rarely anyone had asked for one lately. He dated the whole change, in his own fashion, from the harvest the stocks came down, and said a district that had once needed one man's stamp to trust a scale now seemed to need only its own memory of what honest weight felt like in the hand. The first serious dispute came over a flower stone that read, light at Bettany's oven, and true at Tally's stall. Nayla brought her quarter of the standard. Adiva brought hers. The mismatch turned out to be a worn hook, not a dishonest hand. No one asked me to deliver a verdict. They asked me to witness the comparison while 2 apprentices replaced the hook and checked the scale again. The work took longer than one man's ruling, but everyone who watched could repeat it afterward. Word spread instead through simple habit, which scale a household trusted, which mark on a beam meant something, and which one did not, until Adiva's own stamp, cut without any guild's permission, had become the closest thing the Rao possessed to an official standard. She had not sought that position, only kept working honestly at her forge, while the district decided on its own whose word it trusted most, and the decision arrived the way most honest things in Vetch Hollow now arrived, through use rather than through any vote. Tally told me, a few days into this quiet settling, that he had stopped asking anyone to check his coin at all, since the habit of checking had simply become how the entire row did business now. No single man's presence required to keep it running. Trice said much the same about her rope, that customers measured her work against their own memory of what honest length felt like, a standard she had helped teach them without ever meaning to become anyone's teacher. I found myself, more than once that week, standing at the edge of the row, simply watching the district run itself. No crisis demanding my attention, no crooked scale waiting to be caught, and the quiet of it felt stranger than any fight I had survived so far. Bale appeared at the edge of the row on the 10th day, thinner than I remembered him, dressed in clothes that had clearly been mended more than once since I last saw him standing proud beside his own flawless scale. He stood at the edge of the crowd without approaching. Half the row noticed him. People kept working, but every voice lowered while the market decided what his name now meant. I walked over to him myself, and he asked, without any of his old certainty, whether the district might have use for a man who knew scales better than anyone else in the province, even a man stripped of every license he had once carried. I asked what he wanted. He said honest work under whoever the district trusted to oversee him. A craftsman without a trade, in his own words, was no better than the branded arrival he had tried to humiliate. I told him that decision was not mine alone to make, and led him to Adiva's forge myself, curious more than anything to see what she would say to the man whose long ago refusal had cost her everything, long before her fingers ever did. Adiva looked at him a long while without speaking, turning a half-finished stamp over in her good hand, and finally asked him directly whether he understood exactly what he was asking her to forgive by making this request. He expected no forgiveness. He wanted work, and 9 days on the road had given him time to understand how much his choices had cost people who deserved better. Adeva asked whether 9 days on a road was really enough time to undo a choice that had cost her, for years now, the trade she loved most. Bale said honestly that it was not, that he did not believe any length of walking could undo it, only that he had run out of better ideas for what else to try. I watched her weigh that answer carefully, the way she weighed everything, turning the half-finished stamp in her hand a full turn before she spoke again. For years, she said, everyone had called her refusal foolish, pride chosen over practicality. Vale's admission returned nothing to her hand. Her trade or the 12 years he had taken from her. Even so, his words reached a wound she had taught herself to work around. That was why one plain sentence cost more to hear than she had expected. Nayla, standing near enough to hear the exchange, said flatly that she did not trust a man's roadside conversion after watching him take a rod, a debt, and a district sphere for granted for 2 solid months. I told her I understood her doubt completely and admitted I had not fully settled my own feelings about it either. Watching a man who had once locked my father's rod in a toolbox now stand here asking humbly for work. Adava considered it a long moment, then agreed to take him on. Forgiveness had nothing to do with it. A craftsman who understood scales as Vale did was too rare to waste on principle. Watching him learn under her hand, slowly and without shortcuts, felt to her like a form of justice she could measure every day. She set the terms before the crowd. Vale would work only under her direction, cut no stamp of his own, earn an apprentice's wage, and accept every correction without complaint, however often she repeated it. He agreed to every term without argument, and within the hour, Adava had him seated at her own bench, correcting the angle of his first cut with a patience that surprised me more than her decision to hire him had. He held the burren wrong, too tight against the bench, the grip of a man far more used to commanding than to crafting anything himself. Deva, missing 2 fingers from the very hand that had once cut every legal stamp in this district, reached over and adjusted his fingers herself without a word of judgment attached to the correction. He tried again, slower, and the line still came out crooked, shallow at one end, as nervous cuts often were. Adava told him a man his age relearning a basic grip should expect failures like this for a good while. He asked, with something almost like humor in his voice, whether she intended to enjoy correcting him quite this thoroughly for the whole length of his apprenticeship. She said she intended to enjoy it for at least the first year, and reconsider after that depending on his progress. A few onlookers laughed, and even Vale smiled. It was small, tired, and uncertain, but it was the first real smile I had seen from him since his downfall. I watched all of it a long while. The man who had once owned the finest scale in the province, being taught its most basic craft by the woman he had ruined for refusing to help him corrupt it, and found the sight stranger and more hopeful than I expected it to be. Before he returned fully to his work, Vale looked up and found me still watching, and said, in front of the full row close enough to hear it, that he owed his current chance entirely to Doran Kell, and that he did not intend to waste it twice. Hearing my own name spoken by him plainly, without mockery or calculation behind it, which had never happened since we met, landed heavier than I expected, and I found I had no ready answer for it beyond a short nod. The row's noise picked back up slowly after that, market business resuming around the strange scene at Adava's bench, and by evening most of the district had already moved on to whatever business the day still owed them. Ayla asked me, once the crowd had thinned, whether I actually believed Vale's change was real, and I told her the answer had not come to me yet, only that a district built on honest measure owed even a former enemy the same fair test it demanded of everyone else. She said that answer sounded suspiciously like something Vesa would say, and I told her this district had apparently rubbed off on me more than I realized. She admitted that Adava's patience had moved her doubt a little. Her tone made clear that a little was all Vale had earned, and that she intended to keep watching him. I told her that seemed like exactly the right amount of trust to extend a man with his history, no more, no less, and she said she was relieved to hear I had not gone soft entirely during my time on the road. 3 days later, a rider in unfamiliar livery brought a letter from the capital. It named neither Vale nor Sold, only whoever now held authority over honest measure in Vetch Hollow. Ayla read the direction on the letter twice before handing it to me, and asked what kind of office bothered writing all the way from the capital simply to ask a question the district itself had only just finished answering. Onder, arriving in time to see the seal, said he did not recognize the office it came from, only that a wax that fine and a rider dressed that well rarely traveled this far for a small matter. Vesa, watching from the shrine steps, said the seal smelled of old money and older patience, a combination she had learned, across 2 centuries, to take seriously regardless of how politely a letter's opening line happened to read. I did not open it immediately, turning it over in my hands the way I once turned over a debased coin, weighing what kind of attention a question this specific was likely to bring down on a district that had only just learned to stand on its own honest feet. I finally opened the capital letter 3 mornings after it arrived, Nayla sitting close enough to read it over my shoulder, both of us bracing for whatever new trouble a seal that fine usually carried. It was not trouble, or not the kind either of us expected. The letter concerned Vesa specifically, referencing a report filed by a registrar named Owen Teal, and stated that her shrine's status was under final review, rather than permanent removal. Nayla read it again, slower. Final review sounded less frightening than permanent removal had sounded several weeks earlier, though neither of us trusted the calm of it yet. I carried the letter to the shrine myself and read it aloud to Vesa directly, watching her small face for whatever reaction 200 years of waiting for exactly this kind of news might produce. She listened all the way through without interrupting, which alone told me how much the moment cost her, and when I finished, she asked me to read the closing line again, slowly, the part naming her formally reinstated to the register. I read it twice more before she seemed satisfied it was real, and then she said quietly that she had genuinely stopped expecting to hear those particular words in any lifetime she still had left to live. I asked what final review actually required of us now, and she said she did not know the office's exact procedure, only that Teal's own signature stood beneath the recommendation. A registrar, who had once ordered her wall torn down, now apparently intended to argue for keeping the rest of it standing. Nayla asked whether Teal had changed his mind, or found new numbers that forced a different conclusion. I suspected the two were the same thing to a man like him. Word of the reinstatement spread through the district before the day was out, and even households that had redirected their tithe toward Ilsa Warren's fuller granaries sent word of congratulations. A struck God restored was, by every account I heard that week, still worth celebrating, regardless of where anyone's own loyalty currently sat. Fen Oduva arrived himself 2 days later, his own cart train pulling into the row with considerably more ceremony than his usual trial deliveries had ever carried, and asked to speak with me and Pike both together. He said the province's traders had spent the last months watching Vetch Hollow prove itself against a corrupt waymaster, a cornered market, and a hostile toll gate. They had concluded collectively that a district this stubborn about honest measure was worth building a permanent route around rather than through anyone else's territory. He proposed a full contract, not a trial shipment, covering the whole caravan road from his camp through Vetch Hollow and onward toward the provincial capital, with the district's own measure standing as the guarantee at every stop along the way. Pike shook on it immediately, and I signed my own name to the agreement beside his, the first time I had put ink to a formal contract since arriving in this district, with nothing but a stolen memory of my father's rod. Duva watched me sign, and approval softened his usual flat voice. A man who once offered to lose first had earned this contract honestly, he said, one proven cart at a time. I answered that I intended to keep proving it the same way going forward, and he said that was, in his experience, the only kind of promise a careful man ever actually trusted. Word reached us within the week that traders along the old route through Hask's tollgate had begun quietly rerouting their own cargo toward ours instead, unwilling to pay his toll when an honest, cheaper road now ran directly through Vetch Hollow beside it. Underreported that Hask's own gate stood nearly empty most days now. His toll income dropped by more than half, and that no amount of patience or calculation seemed able to argue a trader back onto a road that cost more and trusted less. I did not hear from Hask himself again, not directly, though Bettany said she had heard secondhand through traders passing through that he had finally begun quietly negotiating to sell his own tollgate lease back to the province. He preferred that apparently to bleeding coin over a road that drew fewer travelers and emptier carts with every season. Market, in the end, had simply chosen not him, exactly the way a market chooses between two bakers or two rope makers, without any single dramatic confrontation required to settle the matter. I thought, more than once that season, about the calm way he had once told me on that empty road that patience had never cost him a district yet, and found a certain grim satisfaction in the fact that patience, in the end, had cost him this one regardless. I did not gloat openly, though I spent one quiet evening at the shrine wall, considering how completely the market had beaten him without a public showdown. A man who had never lied once, never threatened once, had still lost everything to nothing more dramatic than a district simply choosing to trade elsewhere. Trice's workshop never fully returned to what it had been before Hask cornered the province's hemp, but she rebuilt smaller, steadier, and set a modest trade that could not be bought out from under her twice was worth more to her now than the larger one she had lost. She never did see the 40 marks Skell's swindle had cost her that first month, and stopped mentioning it somewhere around the time the venture's own profits quietly outgrew that old number many times over. Wuleta Fen never rebuilt the trade she lost the week Vesa named her heavy weights aloud. She kept her stall through the season, quieter, honest now by necessity more than choice, and the row let her stay without ever fully forgiving her. The provincial office rejected Adiva's petition to restore her guild's standing, as she had expected. She said the district's daily trust in her stamp mattered more now than any distant guild's paperwork. That season she took a second apprentice, a girl from the bread row with steadier hands than either older student. Teaching two at once, Adeva said, left little time to dwell on what the guild office had refused her. Vale himself had grown quietly competent at the bench over the same months, his cuts cleaner, his patience with correction, genuine rather than performed. Adeva admitted grudgingly that she had stopped watching him for signs of his old arrogance returning sometime around midsummer. I still carried the brand on my ear, and I suspect I always would, since no Dawn Miracle and no matched tally stick had ever promised to erase the mark itself. Only the false charge that had once justified cutting it. Nayla found me looking at my own reflection in a still puddle one evening, turning my head slightly to catch the old scar in the fading light, and asked what exactly I was looking for in it. I told her I was not entirely sure, only that I had spent so long trying to undo what the brand represented that I had never once stopped to ask whether I minded carrying the mark itself, once the lie behind it was finally gone. She said a scar that told a true story, even a hard one, was not the same wound as a lie cut into a man's skin, and that she had stopped seeing the brand as a shame the same week she watched me build a beam out of nothing at all. I asked her plainly whether she intended to keep the shrine running here for the rest of her life, or whether the district's growing trade might one day carry her somewhere larger. She said she had buried her mother in this exact ground and did not intend to leave because of any road, however honest or prosperous. I told her I intended to stay as well, having finally reached the end of the only road I had ever actually needed to walk, and she said, after a moment, that she had rather been hoping I would say exactly that. Neither of us made more of it than the words themselves carried, standing there in the last of the light, though I noticed she did not let go of my sleeve again for the rest of that evening, and I did not ask her to. Walked back toward the shrine slowly, in no particular hurry, and she asked what I intended to do with myself, now that the road that had defined my whole arrival here had finally reached its end. I told her I had spent 6 years counting grain for an army that never once thanked me for getting the number right, and that I intended to spend whatever years came next counting for people who actually noticed the difference. She called it a modest ambition for a man who had broken a waymaster, outlasted a guildmaster, and talked a registrar out of salting her mother's grave. I told her modest suited me better than the alternative. Vessa's own Dawn Miracle came due again 3 mornings later, and for the first time since I had known her, she did not ask anyone present what wrong needed correcting, only announced, at first light, that she already had someone in mind. I asked who, and she said only that it was not my business this time, nor Nayla's, nor the district's, only hers, and that a god finally restored to her own register had earned the right to spend at least 1 dawn on a choice entirely her own. I did not press her further, understanding, somewhere underneath my own curiosity, that season upon season of watching her spend every single dawn on someone else's behalf had earned her exactly this much privacy in return. Word reached the row later that same morning that someone, unnamed even by the row's usual gossip, had received an unexpected correction to an old wrong, quiet, private, resolved before most of the district had even finished waking. I asked Vessa, that evening, whether she intended to tell me eventually who it had been, and she said perhaps, someday, once she was certain the correction had actually taken root the way she hoped it would. I let the question rest there, the way I had learned to let most of her private silences rest, and turned my attention instead to the meal Bettany had sent up to the shrine that evening. A full spread earned honestly by a full season's honest trade. Vessa ate slowly, savoring every bite in a way the thin porridge of our first weeks had never allowed. When she finished, she declared the excellent meal still short of what a god of her standing deserved. I laughed until my ribs hurt, then leaned against the rebuilt wall. Worn thin and grateful, I was glad to be exactly where I stood. The final tally of that season, counted openly at the shrine's own rebuilt wall, named the caravan road now running the whole distance between Odova's camp and the provincial capital under the district's measure. More than 30 households stood along its length, and near 100 carts a season now moved honest weight where Hask's toll had once taken its cut. Nayla asked, once the counting was done, whether I finally felt like the debt I had come here owing was settled. I told her some debts settled cleanly and some simply changed shape into something a man could live with carrying, and that I had made my peace with which kind this one turned out to be. Bettany read the final count again. 30 households and nearly 100 carts. Someone at the back asked what the district meant to call itself now that it ran a trade road without one guild stamp. Corin said, dating the moment by the harvest the way he dated everything, that a name would arrive on its own in time, the way every true thing in this district had arrived, through use, rather than through anyone deciding it in advance. Ike said he did not much care what the road got called, only that his oxen had earned every mark of the toll they no longer had to pay, and Tally agreed loudly enough that half the row laughed at the two of them arguing about credit neither had actually asked for. Late that same week, Corin mentioned, almost in passing while dating some other memory by its harvest, that the provincial registry apparently kept a separate archive somewhere, older and far less spoken of than the one that had nearly erased Vesa. This one, he said, was reserved specifically for gods who had not survived their own review, however honestly they had lived. I asked what exactly the province did with a god once fully erased, name and shrine both, and Corin said he did not know, only that he had heard the archive existed, tucked away in some capital office no one outside the registry ever visited. Vesa, overhearing the conversation, went very still, the same stillness I remembered from the night the spades first arrived, and said quietly that she had always wondered exactly that same question herself, and had never once found anyone willing to answer it. I asked whether she intended to go looking for that answer now, restored and steady enough, finally, to risk the road such a question would require. She thought about it a long while, considerably longer than she usually let herself think before answering anything at all. She said that a god who had only just gotten her own name written back into the register might, for once, be allowed to want something simply for its own sake before she went chasing anyone else's. Nayla asked what she wanted instead that season, if she did not want answers about the capital's old archive after all, just yet. Vesa said, with the same blunt honesty that had announced my own bread's short wait on our very first night together, that she wanted a full season of dawns spent on nothing more urgent than watching this district keep proving itself, one honest measure at a time. I told her that sounded like a request the district could manage without much difficulty, and she said good, because she fully intended to hold every single one of us to it. The Capital Archive stayed exactly where it had always been, unvisited, unexplained, a door none of us had yet found the courage or the reason to open. I left the archive to the Capital and slept beside the rebuilt wall. When we opened that door, we would do it on steady feet, together, and by our own choice.
Doran came to Vetch Hollow wanting one honest measure that could clear his name. Instead, he found a district where the guild owned the scales, the stamps, the roads, and therefore every verdict. Vesa could correct a crooked measure at dawn, but she could not erase a deliberate forgery, while Doran's own honest beam became another single point of failure. His decisive choice was to split the reference weight among 4 people and teach the district to check itself. That is the heart of this story. Evidence must be verifiable, authority must be shared, and justice must keep working after the hero steps away. Doran cleared his name, restored Vesa, opened an honest trade road, and found a home with Nayla, but his real victory was making fairness larger than any one person.